North Korea just sent thousands of troops to Ukraine's front lines. With Russia suffering massive losses, over 670,000 soldiers dead or injured, Putin is desperate for reinforcements. Enter North Korea, stepping in with up to 10,000 troops to back up Russian forces. Reports from South Korean intelligence suggest that these soldiers are already fighting alongside Russians. Ukraine's war against Russia may now be a battle against two countries. But why is North Korea doing this? And will it really make a difference? Let's dig into what this means for the war and what might happen next. Let's start with the reports of North Korean troops in Russia. The October 15th report by South Korean intelligence is bolstered by Ukrainian intelligence, though there is some discrepancy in the numbers. Some reports indicate that the number of North Korean troops sent is only 3,000, while others imply a larger figure of 10,000. What's even more concerning is that that might not be the full extent of direct military assistance that North Korea has sent in terms of troops. The actual number of North Koreans could very well be higher. Russian media and sources from the Kremlin have fervently denied any claims that North Korea is directly involved in the fighting on the front lines. A spokesman for the Kremlin suggested that the reports by South Korea and Ukraine were hoaxes or ungrounded rumors intended to cast Russia in yet another bad light. However, the same spokesperson suggested that North Korea is a close neighbor and that the two nations are developing relations in all areas. But how far do these relations go, and do they support the reports of North Korean troops in Russia? The actual alliance between Russia and North Korea goes back decades. One of the most notable such unions was Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, allying itself with North Korea during the Korean War in the 1950s. Since then, the Soviet Union and its inheritor Russia have supported North Korea's economy and military. In fact, some North Korean military designs clearly trace their roots to Soviet weaponry. However, the North Korean involvement in the current war in Ukraine can be explained with much more recent announcements. One of those is a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty between the two nations, signed in June 2024, in which the two countries vowed to come to the other's aid if either's territory is threatened by a third party. The wording of the declaration is suspiciously close to the famous Article 5 of the NATO alliance, which requires all members to defend each other against non-member nations. Considering the implications of Russia now creating its own version of NATO, with autocratic nations like North Korea, the West is concerned about just how deep this alliance goes. And the West does have some reasons to be concerned. It turns out that the military aid from North Korea to Russia goes far beyond mere troops. Reports from as early as February 2024 suggest that North Korea has sent over 13,000 containers of artillery rounds to Russia since August 2023. This implies that North Korea has been helping Russia, at least indirectly, for over a year now. Additionally, the suspected containers were estimated to contain more than 3,122mm artillery shells, or more than 500,000 152mm shells. Since the report couldn't be clear on the exact type of artillery rounds being sent, and Russia itself was a significant domestic producer of the same types of rounds, the actual number and type of rounds are likely a mix of the two. In return, Russia has been sending food and agriculture supplies to North Korea, helping stabilize food prices in the country. But more importantly, food shipments to a country that has a fraction of Russia's population isn't that much of a burden for Russia, and yet gives them access to a resource they might need in the future: manpower. You see, despite its lack of military technology, geopolitical pressure, and influence in the world, North Korea is a heavily militarized nation. Its total population is only around 26 million people, yet there are estimates that it has a whopping 1.3 million active military service members. This is due to the country having some of the strictest mandatory service requirements in the world. North Korean men stay in the military for 8 years, which used to be 10, and women stay for 5 years. According to some estimates, in the event of war, North Korea can mobilize roughly 7.5 million people, more than a quarter of its total population. Sure, that might not mean much when you consider that North Korea technically hasn't been in a war since the mid-20th century. Additionally, the country's military technology is thought to be at a relatively low level compared to Western countries, particularly NATO members. And yet the mention of North Korea allying itself with Russia is still making NATO wary. Let's focus a bit more on that previous notion. The North Korean military doesn't have a particularly high level of experience and technology, but North Korea has been sending military equipment to Russia for more than a year now. Additionally, there are reports that North Korea has also sent its military engineers to oversee and operate the equipment that North Korea can use in its own military. North Korea has also attempted at least 41 missile launches in 2023. The US State Department estimates that the North Korean military budget is paltry compared to its neighbors, at only $4 billion annually. However, the country's conventional military capabilities still include roughly 4,000 tanks, 476 combat-capable aircraft, and 5,500 multiple rocket launchers, among other vehicles. When you combine all of these, it's clear that while the Korean military is using outdated equipment, it has ambitious plans to create an army that can stand on its own, especially against its southern neighbor. But why does the part about North Korea sending engineers matter? Well, the war in Ukraine has become a hotbed for experimentation of how new and old technologies mesh together. Specifically, both Ukraine and Russia started with relatively modern weapons and equipment. However, as the war dragged on, both countries developed their strategies in two directions. First, the nations resorted to using their older, obsolete vehicles, such as the T-64 and T-72 tanks, or old towed artillery pieces. In some cases, the weapons that could be seen on the battlefield were the same ones that were used during World War II. On the other hand, Russia has also had opportunities to modernize its equipment, considering it's one of the largest militaries in the world with close ties to China. To that end, modern T-90M tanks and MiG-35 fighter jets were considered the pinnacles of Russian military technology. But the real kicker in the Russian military was artillery pieces. Russia has the world's largest arsenal of towed and self-propelled artillery, although they've lost close to 19,000 of these weapons throughout the war. The advancements in Russian artillery were so high that the most modern self-propelled launcher, Tu-S-19, could fire roughly 10 rounds per minute. This far outstrips the capabilities of Western artillery. Even older Russian artillery was considered among the most capable in its generation. So in addition to their ability to manufacture more artillery shells than any other country in the world, North Korea is using its own industry to boost those numbers. The result is a staggering onslaught caused by Russia's artillery, which was one of the main reasons Ukraine was hard-pressed to launch counteroffensives in Donbass. Russia's ability to set up a defensive line of artillery and use its numbers advantage to press forward made a lack of modern tanks relatively unimportant. But Ukraine also received relatively modern weapons and vehicles as donations from NATO. Among these are the vital Patriot air defense systems, M1 Abrams tanks, M2 Bradleys, and CV-90 infantry support vehicles, and even F-16 fighter jets that could directly counter the numerous Russian MiG-29 jets. Throughout all that, the presence of North Korean engineers and military officers on the Russian side of the battlefield becomes a little clear. These men and women can soak in real-world experience about which weapons are working on the battlefield and which aren't. Furthermore, North Korea has also been sending its own long-range missiles for Russia to use. One of its chief weapons is the KN-23 missile, with a maximum range of roughly 400 to 430 miles. By operating the missiles in real missions, the engineers can get vital data points on why their tests keep failing. More importantly, the experience gained from each launch will possibly allow North Korea to manufacture better missiles moving forward. However, North Korea's economy and geopolitical isolation means that any progress it makes on this front likely won't let it catch up to its neighbor. Let's consider the aforementioned KN-23s. Analysts suggest that roughly half of the missile tests that North Korea has conducted so far have failed, with missiles not reaching their intended targets. This means that currently the potential danger that these weapons pose is relatively low, especially given that both Russia and Ukraine have proven that layered anti-air defenses are consistent in dealing with that kind of threat. But if the missiles sent to Russia get tested enough in real-life situations and against more modern defensive measures, there's a small chance that the engineers can figure out what keeps going wrong with the launches and improve their chances of success. With Ukraine as the testing ground, however, even failed tests can pose a significant danger to Ukraine. A missile that only partially reaches its target is still likely to land somewhere in Ukraine, potentially causing severe collateral damage and civilian deaths. As a result, North Korea is basically using Russia as a proxy to test its own combat preparedness. A bulk of it is through determining its capacity for making artillery ammunition. Exporting facilities are working at full capacity, while domestic ones are only at 30%. Meanwhile, a larger part of it is making sure that North Korean weapons can be improved to have better odds of hitting their intended targets. But just how much are the added 10,000 soldiers from North Korea going to matter on the grand scale of the war in Ukraine? The answer is not that much. You have to remember that they are unlikely to be trained and experienced people. In fact, it's highly likely that their presence on the battlefield serves a completely different purpose to the one you might think. As mentioned, North Korea has an active military personnel of close to 1.3 million. That puts it around the same size as the US or Russia, if you believe the numbers the Kremlin or Russian analysts provide on the latter's military prowess. And Russia is estimated to have lost more than 670,000 soldiers who are either dead or too injured to return to military service. So 10,000 men from a country that can't train its soldiers on modern military tactics or perform international exercises are practically a drop in the bucket in terms of bodies being thrown to the war. In fact, data from September 2024 suggests that it was the deadliest month for Russia, with over 1,250 casualties daily, at least according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And it was the fifth consecutive month when the casualty count didn't drop below 1,200 for a day. Some analysts suggest that the Russian death toll is only going to get higher in the coming months. The reason for this is the approaching cold weather, where Ukrainians will have the advantage of fighting on their own land and weapons and vehicles that are better suited to fighting in snowy conditions. So when you consider how many soldiers Russia has lost and how many soldiers North Korea has, the implication is clear. The 10,000 troops are likely only the start of North Korea's deployments in Russia. Based on past statistics, those 10,000 men can theoretically be wiped out in slightly over a week if they get put anywhere close to the battlefield. This is also probably why the reports of sightings of North Korean troops are slightly vague, as there's no confirmation that they have actually been deployed to an active part of the front line. As such, it's highly likely that North Korea will send more troops to Russia, and possibly soon. Even if they need a few months of follow-up training before being deployed to the actual front lines, Russia can get yet another stockpile of soldiers ready to go to Ukraine. And it wouldn't be a moment too soon. That's because Russia's active military personnel counts can be highly misleading. While analysts suggest that Russia has 1.3 million active personnel, it's highly likely that a bulk of those are military conscripts serving mandatory one-year terms. These soldiers are in a similar state to the ones North Korea is sending. They're unlikely to be trained or well equipped to deal with Ukrainian tactics and more modern weapons. Worse yet, some interviews with prisoners of war from Kursk suggest that Russia has been skimping as much as possible on military training. Interviewees have said that some soldiers received as little as 2 weeks of training before being shipped to military posts to serve. And Russia can't even legally use its conscripts abroad. Technically, Putin could try to overthrow that decision and change the law. However, the ban on deploying conscripts abroad came about after the disastrous Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, which had a civilian death toll of several million and soldier casualties following close behind. Therefore, forcing conscripts to join the fighting in Ukraine, or at least publicly acknowledging it, would likely be extremely bad press for Putin. So he's forced to rely on contract soldiers and mercenaries for Russia's offensive campaigns. Meanwhile, on the other side, volunteer fighters from all over the world have registered to fight in the Ukrainian International Legion. But even with their contract soldiers and mercenaries, Russia's troop numbers are likely going to be much smaller than implied. According to a report by The Riddle, the Russian military has signed close to 500,000 contracts in 2023. However, the same report suggests that the army has significantly lowered the minimum duration spelled out in the contract. For prisoners who join the military to get a reduced sentence, the duration could be as low as 3 months. That means that a single person could have signed multiple contracts in a single year. Additionally, not all soldiers are going to renew their contracts after they expire, putting a further dent in Russia's active military numbers. The Riddle report implies that out of the indicated 500,000 contracts, only 180,000 of them are likely to stay active throughout 2024. Putin has stated that the upper age limit for military service has been increased to pump up the numbers. However, note that these will be conscripts for the first year of service, and thus unusable in Ukraine. That means that Russia would need to wait for those recruits to sign new contracts after mandatory service. All the while, Russia has been losing soldiers left and right. But luckily for them, North Korea has plenty of soldiers to go around, as well as missiles and artillery shells to send to Russia. And North Korea desperately needs funds, food, and military expertise, which are all things that Russia could feasibly provide. How are Russia and North Korea justifying these actions? The answer is related to the aforementioned military pact between the two nations and Ukraine's recent successes. In August, Ukraine managed to do what was previously unthinkable: go on the offensive. The pivotal incursion of Kursk was a 3-week-long military campaign that saw Ukraine occupy roughly 500 square miles of Russian territory. Russian conscripts and soldiers stationed in Kursk have either surrendered or retreated from the invading Ukrainian soldiers. The Kremlin's reply to the situation was sluggish. Russia failed to mount a significant defense against the incoming soldiers. It will be a month after the operation started that Russia finally announced a counteroffensive in the region. Even then, most recent reports from mid-October suggest that Russia has managed to get back only half of the occupied territory under its own control. The invasion of Kursk was a huge victory for Ukraine. It showed that Russia wasn't well prepared to fight in its own territory. But even more importantly, Putin's threats about using nuclear weapons should Russia get invaded turned out to be relatively harmless. It's allowed NATO to reconvene and suggest more aggressive measures of arming Ukraine. NATO's military chief stated that Ukraine could possibly use donated long-range missiles to perform precision strikes deeper into Russia's territory, something that the US forbade when sending their contribution of missiles. But it's the invasion of Kursk that is giving Putin the excuse for getting North Korea involved. With the military pact between the two countries signed before the invasion happened, Putin can claim that Russia's territorial integrity has been threatened. The pact can go into effect, allowing North Korea to send its own troops to Russia to help defend it against the Ukrainian army. Of course, the true purpose of why the soldiers are there is more likely because they boost the Russian numbers on the front line, far from Russian lands. After all, Russia has plenty of military conscripts that it can sacrifice to defend its own borders, but probably not enough contract soldiers to keep sending to Ukraine. So the North Koreans are likely to be added to the pile of dead Russia is amassing as part of its war efforts. There's a bit of a method to Putin's madness here. While Russia has suffered significant losses in Ukraine, the Ukrainian military isn't faring that much better. There's also the fact that Ukraine is smaller and a less populous country than Russia, so it has an even smaller supply of men to draw from. And North Korea will likely be happy to send more and more soldiers to Ukraine. After all, the country has mandatory military service that spans years, so it can quickly replenish its own supplies. The prestige and, more importantly, experience North Korea's military would gain from its field testing in Ukraine is likely going to give the country even more of a morale boost. This can create a positive feedback loop of North Korea sending a relatively unending stream of soldiers to Russia, all with the goal of giving them either valuable experience to fight a future war, likely against South Korea, or reducing the strain on the country's economy. The Ukrainian invasion of Kursk is perhaps the perfect opportunity for the North Korean army to get that experience. The Ukrainian military has a limited presence in the occupied territory. Also, technically, with North Korea being bound only to defend Russia, both countries could claim that the deployment of North Koreans in Kursk is only acknowledging and fulfilling the military pact they signed. Beyond giving Russia more soldiers to work with, deploying North Koreans to Kursk means that the Russian military won't have to divest a lot of its contract soldiers from the main front line in Donbass. It will allow Russia to keep up the tempo it has in the region and continuously pressure the Ukrainian military to stick to being to the defense. So as long as Ukraine is using its long-range capabilities to defend itself, it can't put too many resources into mounting precision strikes. Those precision strikes have so far targeted supply roads, stockpiles, and other vital military targets. However, Ukraine has also damaged or destroyed some oil refineries in the west of the country. This limits Russia's access to vital fuel for its war machine, literally. The country was forced to stop exporting diesel and gas to most other trading nations and has asked Kazakhstan to prepare a supply to send to Russia instead. Even more importantly, the lack of domestic supply and refining capacity means that Russia won't be able to export nearly as much oil and gas abroad. If Russia needs to start refining the crude oil and gas it would otherwise send to China and India, its biggest cash cow suddenly disappears. The oil and gas industry exports have been estimated to account for roughly 45% of Russia's federal budget. If those profits start dipping, Russia's economy is in big trouble. Remember, Russia's not getting these North Korean soldiers for free either. It's sending North Korea supplies and possibly money in return. If Russia's economy declines too much, even North Korea might not be able to continue supplying soldiers. But there's an even more important aspect of why Russia doesn't want Ukraine to keep launching long-range strikes. Ukraine has already started targeting Moscow. The drone attack on September 10th was among the largest offensive operations Ukraine has mounted since the beginning of the war. It sent over 140 drones, scattering them across Russia toward vital targets. 20 drones were shot down over the Moscow region by Russian anti-air defenses, but the attack still damaged a few buildings, killing at least one person, and caused widespread cancellation of air traffic surrounding the capital. For the bulk of the war, Moscow itself wasn't directly affected by the fighting. The Kremlin's propaganda machine worked in Putin's favor to pacify, sometimes forcefully, the large population centers. The conscription efforts were largely targeting the poorer areas of the country, often promising wages that were as much as 3 to 4 times higher than the national average. But when Moscow became a target, all of that stopped mattering. Putin's influence over Russia persists so long as the upper classes that reside in Moscow are kept safe. If Ukraine can manage to remove that sense of protection, with its ability to strike the Russian capital with long-range weapons, all bets are off. The same people who are keeping Putin in power can be the ones who depose him of it. And that's precisely why North Korean soldiers are important to Russia at the moment. They present Putin with an avenue to distract Ukraine for at least a little bit longer, giving Russia some breathing room to keep up the pressure in Donbass and determine the next best steps. But are the North Koreans up for the battle? Reports state that some North Korean soldiers have already abandoned their posts in Kursk and Bryansk. While there were only 18 soldiers who abandoned the war effort, it speaks of the fact that the soldiers themselves were likely being pressured to go to Russia, possibly under threats or penalties. North Korean soldiers might have realized that the war in Ukraine is far bloodier than they could ever imagine. It's said that some are even using the opportunity to try to defect from North Korea altogether. With the reports of defections coming mere days after the sighting of North Korean soldiers among the Russian military, it's obvious that Russia can't really use the North Korean soldiers to their full extent. First, there's the probable lack of military training. Secondly, the North Korean soldiers are unlikely to speak Russian, creating a near insurmountable language barrier. This lack of cohesiveness between Russian and North Korean troops probably means that Ukraine won't have significant problems dealing with the first batch of 10,000 soldiers. They're likely going to fall apart faster than Russian conscripts, and they might not even get deployed to the front line in Ukraine to boot. But what about the next batch or the one after that? If Russia sees North Korean soldiers as an opportunity to throw something other than its own men into the meat grinder to save face, it's most likely going to take it. The fact that the North Korean soldiers aren't able to function as well as Russian troops won't really matter to Putin. They'd only be there to prevent Russia from losing more experienced soldiers or to soak up bullets in the hope that Ukraine is starting to run dry. This would mean that North Korea might be the catalyst for Russia being able to extend the war for at least a few years, and that's a dangerous prospect for Ukraine for one simple reason. The US is holding its presidential elections in November, and former President Donald Trump's odds of being re-elected are relatively high. Trump has been pretty vocal about trying to maintain a closer relationship with Russia than current President Joe Biden's administration ever was. Furthermore, he's stated that the US isn't getting as much out of NATO as it's providing to the alliance. While there's no precedent for it, Trump winning the election and getting inaugurated next year could mean the slow start of NATO losing its largest economic and military equipment supplier. If Trump maintains the same sentiment about sending donations to Ukraine, then Ukraine might be needing to finish the war sooner rather than later. And if North Korea's troops prove to be at least partially effective at prolonging the war, there's no telling how the tide of the conflict can change. But what do you think? Are the North Korean soldiers going to make a difference in Ukraine? Or is this all just a part of Russia's posturing that it still has a chance to win the war? Russia is on the ropes. Its forces are taking heavy losses, with hundreds of soldiers being wiped out daily. The war in Ukraine has dragged on far longer than the Kremlin ever expected, and now Russian President Vladimir Putin is running out of options. So in a desperate move, it appears that Russia has turned to an unlikely and controversial ally, North Korea. But not for weapons and ammunition, which Pyongyang has already been accused of supplying to Moscow. This time it's different, far more serious. Reports suggest North Korean soldiers may be sent to the front lines, real boots on the ground, an alliance that marks a dangerous new chapter in this war. It's a move that begs the question, if North Korea is willing to throw its weight behind Russia, what does that mean for the war in Ukraine? And more importantly, will this prompt NATO, the world's most powerful military alliance, to step up and fight directly for Ukraine? In this video, we'll break down this alliance and what it means for the war, and how it could force NATO to reconsider its role in Ukraine. Because at this point, it's not just about Ukraine anymore, it's about the future of global conflict. Before diving into any scenarios, let's look at the basics. After all, you can't understand the full picture without first learning what's going on with North Korea's involvement. In other words, we need the facts before we can face the consequences. So let's start with what we know. We know that the reports on North Korean involvement in the war in Ukraine are stacking up, and they're hard to ignore. Ukrainian military intelligence, Ukrainian government organizations, South Korean intelligence, and Western media, they're all saying the same thing. North Korean troops are entering the war on Russia's side. However, all these sources can't seem to agree on one thing, just how many North Korean soldiers are actually involved. A Ukrainian military intelligence source revealed to the BBC that Russia is forming a unit of 3,000 North Korean soldiers. Kyiv believes that this unit might be preparing in Ulan-Ude, close to the Mongolian border. At the same time, a military source from Russia's Far East confirms that the North Koreans have already arrived at a base near Usyrysk, north of Vladivostok, but stresses that the numbers are absolutely nowhere near 3,000. However, this source refused to specify how many soldiers were actually present in the Far East. This leads us to the reports from South Korea's National Intelligence Service, or NIS for short, which claims that 1,500 soldiers have already been shipped to Russia. These soldiers reportedly arrived between October 8th and 13th, 2024, transported on 7 Russian ships to Vladivostok. But they didn't come alone. Reports also suggest they brought uniforms, weapons, and even forged Russian identification documents. However, the NIS claims that this is only the first wave of soldiers. According to the agency, more North Koreans will follow, potentially swelling their numbers to a staggering 12,000 soldiers. That's a number large enough to make a real impact. Although the figure hasn't been officially confirmed, it signals just how deeply North Korea is getting involved in the war in Ukraine. As for where these soldiers are heading, the North Korean unit from Ulan-Ude is expected to be deployed to Russia's Kursk province, the same area where Ukrainian forces launched an incursion back in August. Their role may be to guard sections of the Russo-Ukrainian borders, freeing up Russian units for more direct fighting elsewhere. But don't expect the North Korean soldiers on the front lines just yet. Experts like the editor of Ukrainian publication Defense Express, Valery Ryabik, believes that these troops will be used in more supportive roles at first. But even if they're not sent immediately into combat, their very presence allows Russia to shift more of its own forces into offensive positions. Now you might think all of this evidence sounds pretty speculative. Where's the hard proof? Well, what about video proof? Undoubtedly, the most striking evidence of North Korean involvement comes from video footage shared with CNN by the Ukrainian Center for Strategic Communication. In this clip, North Korean soldiers are seen queuing at a Russian training ground, receiving uniforms and equipment. Although their conversations can't be fully understood due to low audio quality, they do appear to be speaking Korean. And this is only one video. Another one, geolocated by CNN, shows North Korean troops arriving at the Sogivka training ground, close to Russia's border with China. A Russian speaker can be overheard saying, "We can't film them," followed by, "There are millions of them here. This is just the beginning." While millions is clearly an exaggeration, these words underscore the scale of this development as well as the secrecy surrounding it. CNN also shared a copy of the questionnaire the North Korean recruits were asked to fill out upon arriving in Russia, providing their sizing for hats, headgear, uniforms, and shoes. The top of this questionnaire is written in Russian, while the various size options are written in Korean. This indicates that the North Koreans aren't just being integrated, they're being outfitted for their new role. The questionnaire and the two videos also back up reports from the NIS, which claim that the soldiers are being equipped and trained for deployment to Ukraine. According to the NIS, the North Korean soldiers, currently stationed at military bases in Vladivostok, Urasisk, Khabarovsk, and Blagoveshchensk, will only be sent to combat zones once they finish their training. Common courtesy that hasn't been given to many Russian nationals who have been thrown into the fight with minimal preparation, undertrained, and under-equipped. But given who these North Korean troops reportedly are, special treatment shouldn't come as a surprise. You see, the NIS reports that the units sent to Russia were personally inspected by Kim Jong-Un himself before deployment, an indication that these soldiers could be among North Korea's elite forces. Given the country's distrust of conscripts who might be prone to defect, it's likely that special operations soldiers are involved in Ukraine, as they are highly trained and, more importantly, highly loyal. Now, special forces might sound intimidating right off the bat, the kind of elite troops you wouldn't want to face on the battlefield. You might envision the likes of the US Navy SEALs, the British SAS, or even Russia's own Spetsnaz, elite units known for precision, deadly tactics, and cutting-edge training. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is North Korea we're talking about, a country notorious for its outdated equipment, unreliable tactics, and a military more skilled in grand parades than modern warfare. Sure, they're loyal, maybe to a fault, but when it comes to battlefield prowess, they're hardly in the same league as the world's top special forces. So what exactly can Ukraine expect from these North Korean forces sent to oppose it? Well, these personnel reportedly sent to Vladivostok have been sourced from the estimated 200,000-strong ranks of the Special Operations Forces, the SOF, primarily tasked with probing and testing South Korea's defenses. Now, this number alone will probably raise some eyebrows. Why? Because the world's truly elite special forces count their ranks in the hundreds, not the hundreds of thousands. The SEALs, about 2,500 active duty members. The British SAS, 400 to 500 elite operatives. Even Russia's Spetsnaz, as infamous as they are, doesn't come anywhere close to that six-figure claim. So either Kim is redefining what it means to be special, or we're dealing with an inflated sense of military grandeur. Ahmed Hassan, CEO of Grey Dynamics, a London-based intelligence firm, puts things in perspective. The North Korean SOF may be special by their own standards, but that's hardly a badge of honor when measured against NATO or Russian criteria. If there's a ranking between 1 and 10, he says, let's say 1 is a basic soldier and 10 is Delta Force or the SAS, then the NK Force sits at a solid 5. Essentially, they're the middle-tier performers of the Special Forces world, if we're generous, that is. The only area where the SOF truly ranks at the top is secrecy. Without a doubt, this is one of the most secretive military units in the world, which shouldn't be surprising given its country of origin. For the most part, the SOF is an enigma to Western powers, loyal and highly trained, yet lacking the advanced military equipment seen in NATO forces. The SOF has a colorful history too. Founded in 1968, they gained notoriety after a disastrous raid on the Blue House, South Korea's presidential residence, which resulted in the death of 26 out of 31 operatives involved. Given that their introduction to the world was an outright disaster, it shouldn't be surprising that not much else is known about any of their follow-up exploits. There have been reports that the SOF has been deployed to Syria to support Bashar al-Assad's regime. However, there's also speculation that these troops were merely North Korean mercenaries, further muddying the waters of their true capabilities. What we do know for sure is that they participated in a rare public event in 2017, proudly marching alongside regular army soldiers, because nothing says elite special forces quite like a synchronized march. The same year, North Korean state media showcased SOF troops adorned in black camouflage paint and dark sunglasses, wielding what was described as a new rifle fitted with a grenade launcher. Yet, several reports pointed out their uniforms bore a striking resemblance to those worn by South Korean special forces, known as the Black Berets. Perhaps South Korea should take solace in the adage that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Even the few details we do know about the SOF are enough to pose a question. Will their presence really change the tide of battle, or are they just another set of boots on the ground for Russia that will struggle? Given the challenges they'll face in Ukraine, the second option seems far more likely. Whether the North Korean soldiers fighting for Russia are truly special forces or regular troops, one thing's for sure, their integration will be an uphill battle. For starters, there's the language barrier. North Korean soldiers aren't just non-native speakers of Russian, they're entirely non-Russian speaking. This poses a significant problem in the chaos of battle, where communication is critical. Integrating thousands of North Koreans into Russian military units isn't as simple as adding more manpower to the ranks. One analyst pointed out the difficulties Russia faced when trying to incorporate hundreds of prisoners into their forces, and those guys spoke Russian. Now imagine the added layer of complexity when the troops on the ground don't even share a common language. Moreover, the Eastern Front in Ukraine has morphed into a war of attrition, a brutal meat grinder where traditional covert operations and special forces tactics might be rendered ineffective. With the current state of affairs, the real question becomes, what exactly will these North Korean troops be doing on the battlefield? Without a clear role, they risk becoming an additional liability rather than a valuable asset. Another daunting challenge is the lack of recent combat experience among North Korean forces. While the country boasts an impressive active military of around 1.28 million, the fourth strongest in the world, most of these soldiers have not been engaged in any significant combat operations in years. Unlike Russia's military, which for better or worse has been actively involved in conflicts, North Korean troops are largely known for their engineering and construction skills. The war in Ukraine could very well mark their first foray into international conflict, and entering such a high-stakes environment without proper experience could spell disaster. There's also the issue of tactics. North Korea's military structure follows the old Soviet model, which raises questions about how well its motorized infantry units could adapt to the realities of modern warfare. Their traditional tactics may not translate well in a battle defined by rapid maneuvers, technology, and adaptability. And let's not forget about the risk of exposing North Koreans to life in the West. If these soldiers find themselves in a situation where they can see how the other half lives, particularly when compared to the stark realities of their home country, defections could become a serious issue, even with these so-called elite forces. That's why Bruce W. Bennett, a senior international defense researcher at RAND, an American research institute, has called on the US to start information campaigns aimed at convincing North Korean soldiers sent to Russia to defect. This just leaves us with one more question before discussing what the presence of these troops means for the war in Ukraine. Why did North Korea send troops in the first place? Well, for starters, Putin is in desperate need of manpower. After 2.5 years of war, Russia has suffered unbelievable losses. Reports from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces indicate the country has lost 678,520 troops since February 2022. With that severe blow to his ranks, what does Putin see as a solution? Bring in the North Koreans to do some of the fighting. It's a desperate gamble. But that's where Russia finds itself, backed into a corner and scrambling for any allies it can get. But there's more to it. Russia might not be reaching for foreign troops if any of its latest mandatory mobilization efforts have been successful. Valery Akimenko from the UK's Conflict Studies Research Centre argues that deploying North Korean soldiers might be Putin's way of dealing with the fallout of that failed mobilization. The Russian military has faced public pushback, and many conscripts have simply refused to fight. So if you can't convince your own citizens to risk their lives, why not outsource the job? But why would North Korea agree to help under these circumstances? Well, it turns out that Moscow and Pyongyang have a lot in common. Most importantly, both are pariahs in the West, pushing them to deepen their ties in recent months. Kim even referred to Putin as his closest comrade, while wishing the Russian president a happy 72nd birthday on October 8th. However, for the two countries, it's not just about diplomatic niceties, it's about survival in a hostile global environment. But let's not kid ourselves, this burgeoning relationship is driven solely by shared incentives. As mentioned, Moscow desperately needs soldiers, and Pyongyang money and technology. It's a classic case of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. North Korea is cash-strapped and isolated, and the prospect of receiving aid from Russia is too tempting to ignore. Not to mention, the country could substantially benefit from access to Russian military technology, something Moscow would typically be hesitant to share. Kim wants his country recognized as a nuclear state. A little Russian tech could go a long way toward that goal. Plus, being involved in an active conflict gives North Korea a chance to demonstrate its military capabilities on a global stage, a dream for any nation seeking legitimacy. But beyond the theatrics, the arrangement between Russia and North Korea provides North Korean soldiers with something they sorely lack: real combat experience. Now, on the one hand, this can be a major challenge for these troops, as we already mentioned. But on the other hand, they can see it as a chance to finally get a taste of battle after years of isolation from actual warfare. This can be a huge deal for a military whose personnel have largely been trained for parades and posturing rather than practical combat situations. If they do manage to make it back to North Korea, they all come back with valuable insights into modern warfare, tactics, and equipment that could be used to bolster their own military capabilities. In short, North Korea's involvement isn't just a random act of kindness. It's a strategic play for survival and growth in a world that has largely turned its back on them. Both nations are operating from a position of weakness, so they're naturally drawn to one another in a bid for survival. And as they move forward, it's clear both Russia and North Korea will be keeping their eyes on the prize, mutual benefit at all costs. This leads us to the mutually beneficial security arrangement that holds the answer to the titular question of the video. You see, in June of 2024, during a rare visit to North Korea, Putin and Kim signed what they described as a peaceful and defensive pact. However, truthfully, this landmark agreement is less about maintaining peace and more about establishing a military alliance designed to provide mutual assistance in the event of aggression against either nation. This partnership, framed by the US State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller as a new level of desperation by Russia, indicates a profound need for support as Russia continues to face heavy losses in its protracted conflict. Now let's break down the specifics of this pact. The agreement represents a substantial shift in the two nations' historical ties, which have waxed and waned over the decades. It replaces previous deals from 1961, 2000, and 2001, marking the first formalized military cooperation between the two countries in over 20 years. The pact is primarily designed to bolster both nations' defenses against what they perceive as encroaching threats from the West, particularly the US, South Korea, and Japan. While the exact text of this mutual defense pact remains classified, key elements have been highlighted that offer insight into its implications. For the purpose of this video, the Mutual Assistance Clause is front and center. This clause stipulates that both countries will support each other in the event of an attack. Now, you might be wondering how this clause, or this agreement in general, could possibly justify North Korea's involvement in Ukraine when Russia is the aggressor. Well, when the armed forces of Ukraine launched an incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast, the situation changed. Russia could interpret this incursion as an attack on its territory, thus triggering the Mutual Assistance Clause of the Defense Pact. This allows Russia to call on North Korea for military support under the guise of collective self-defense. Now, this might sound far-fetched, given that Russia initiated the broader conflict by invading Ukraine. However, legally, the incursion into Russian territory provides just enough of a pretext for Russia to frame itself as the defender. Of course, this would raise numerous complexities. For North Korean military involvement to be considered truly legitimate, Russia would need to demonstrate that Ukraine's actions constitute an armed attack on its sovereign territory and that the response is proportionate to the threat posed. The principle of proportionality is essential here. Excessive or disproportionate military responses could violate international humanitarian law. Additionally, the world can see right through these claims of self-defense, particularly given North Korea's ongoing sanctions and Russia's widespread condemnation of its invasion of Ukraine. So while this cooperation pact might offer a convenient legal pretext for Russia to call on North Korea's assistance, the reality is far more transparent. This call is nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse for further escalation, not a genuine act of self-defense. This brings us to the crucial follow-up question: why can't Ukraine call on NATO's assistance then? Well, unfortunately, there's a pretty straightforward answer to this question. Ukraine can't call on NATO's assistance because it's not a NATO member. NATO's collective defense mechanism, enshrined in Article 5 of its charter, only applies to member states. And as much as Ukraine's leadership, especially President Volodymyr Zelensky, has pleaded for accelerated membership or more direct involvement from the alliance, the country is still in the partner category. This means that NATO is under no legal obligation to intervene militarily, no matter how dire the situation gets. And according to Zelensky, the situation will get rather dire. The Ukrainian president has repeatedly expressed alarm over the potential involvement of North Korean forces in the conflict. According to the reports he received, up to 10,000 North Korean troops could be preparing to fight for Russia. This is no longer about transferring weapons. It's actually about transferring people from North Korea to the occupying military forces, he said, painting a troublesome picture of a conflict that could escalate beyond current borders. But Zelensky isn't the only one concerned about the prospect of North Korean troops joining the fight. Though it didn't independently make any accusations against Pyongyang yet, the US did express concerns over the potential North Korean military presence in Ukraine. On the one hand, North Korean involvement would allow Pyongyang to get real-time feedback for the first time, emboldening the already overzealous nation. As General Charles Flynn, the US Army's Asia-Pacific commander, puts it, that kind of feedback from a real battlefield to North Korea to be able to make adjustments to their weapons, their ammunition, their capabilities, and even their people, to me, is very concerning. However, there's also the question of what North Korean involvement would do for the war. US lawmakers, such as House Intelligence Committee Chair Mike Turner, have labeled the reported troop movements as alarming and an extreme escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. This sentiment was echoed by the French Foreign Ministry spokesman Christophe Lemoyne, who referred to the North Korean involvement in Ukraine as an extremely worrying and serious development. This reaction is particularly notable as, if you remember, French President Emmanuel Macron was the only Western leader to suggest sending in NATO forces to defend Ukraine, which caused quite a stir at the time. But what does NATO have to say this time? For their part, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte has expressed that the alliance is closely monitoring the situation, but he also refrained from confirming troop deployments. This suggests that even with these rising tensions, NATO's hands are tied. The legality of intervention remains a significant barrier. The worst part? Ukraine doesn't appear to be any closer to NATO membership than it was at the beginning of the conflict, which leaves the country in a precarious position. Although Zelensky has recently presented his victory plan for Ukraine, which includes NATO membership, concrete steps towards reaching this goal appear elusive. Furthermore, NATO diplomats emphasize that Ukraine's borders must be clearly defined before any membership can be considered, which is complicated by the fact that about 20% of Ukraine is currently controlled by Russian forces. So for now, NATO is only willing to pledge money to Ukraine, not membership. But could this change if North Korea joins in a greater capacity? Absolutely. The potential for a major escalation could absolutely prompt NATO to rethink its position. If North Korean involvement results in significant military gains for Russia or increases the intensity of the conflict, it could compel NATO members to act more decisively. Moreover, the political ramifications of North Korean involvement could pressure NATO to intervene, particularly if that involvement leads to humanitarian crises or significant threats to European security. If North Korean actions are perceived as destabilizing the region or contributing to atrocities, NATO might justify intervention to uphold international norms and protect the stability of Europe. Throw the implications of a strengthened Russo-North Korean alliance into the mix, and NATO could truly have no choice but to intervene. After all, we're talking about the alliance of two nuclear-armed states, led by two of the world's most unpredictable and aggressive regimes. A strengthened Russo-North Korean alliance would not only destabilize Ukraine, but could threaten the entire security of Europe. But here's the issue. If it comes down to it, NATO will essentially have to choose between two impossible choices: standing by and letting Ukraine fall to an emboldened Russia backed by North Korea, or stepping in and risking World War III. You see, if NATO steps into the conflict directly, with troops and new weaponry, the stakes would escalate to an unprecedented level, turning what is currently a regional war into a global one. A direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia would almost certainly trigger Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which would obligate all NATO members to come to each other's defense, effectively turning the conflict into a multinational war between the West on one side and Russia and North Korea on the other. But remember, this isn't just about boots on the ground or aerial engagements. It's about 4 out of 5 recognized nuclear weapons states facing off in an open conflict. The potential for catastrophic escalation is undeniable. Russia, already under immense pressure from sanctions and military losses, would perceive NATO intervention as an existential threat. In such a scenario, Putin has made it clear that Russia wouldn't hesitate to resort to nuclear weapons. After all, Russian military doctrine allows for the use of tactical nuclear weapons in conventional warfare, especially if Russia believes its territorial integrity or regime survival is under immediate threat. Introducing North Korea into the equation, another country believed to possess nuclear weapons, only amplifies the danger. So in this context, World War III wouldn't just be another large-scale conventional conflict like World War II. It would almost inevitably involve nuclear strikes. And once the nuclear threshold is crossed, a path to de-escalation is virtually non-existent. Both sides will be compelled to retaliate in kind, leading to widespread destruction on a level that humanity has never experienced. Even if the conflict only involved Russia and the US, NATO's most powerful member, the outcome would be nothing short of apocalyptic. After all, with 5,044 and 5,500 nuclear warheads respectively, the US and Russia own nearly 90% of the global nuclear arsenal. In a potential conflict between these two countries, entire cities, infrastructure, and possibly even nations would be wiped out within hours. The death toll could reach into the tens of millions, with the long-term consequences of nuclear fallout and environmental damage affecting billions across the globe. The 2019 simulation devised by Princeton's University Program on Science and Global Security gives a more precise overview of these figures. The simulation estimated that over 90 million people would either be dead or injured within the first few hours of a nuclear conflict between the US and Russia. Of course, we also can't underestimate the involvement of other countries. NATO's involvement in Ukraine would likely draw in other global powers such as China. The aspiring global superpower, which has a complex relationship with both Russia and the West, could be forced to take sides in the conflict. Of course, China could also use this escalation to further its own interests in regions like Taiwan or the South China Sea, though a nuclear war would undoubtedly make any strategic gamesmanship in these regions futile. Other nations, whether aligned with NATO or sympathetic to Russia and North Korea, could be pulled into the conflict as well, expanding the scope well beyond Europe and Asia. Basically, what starts in Ukraine would spiral into a conflict engulfing every corner of the world. But let's ask you, do you agree? Can NATO plus North Korea in Ukraine only equal World War III? If so, what do you think will be the trigger for NATO's involvement? Or do you think a major global war can be avoided altogether? And if so, how? China's patience with Russia is running out. With North Korean troops now on Russian soil, Beijing isn't happy, and this unexpected alliance could shake up the entire conflict in Ukraine. On October 18, 2024, South Korean intelligence dropped a bombshell. North Korea had sent about 1,500 troops to Russia to support its war efforts in Ukraine. But according to Ukrainian intelligence, that was just the beginning. The real number may be closer to 10,000, with North Korean engineers and equipment joining the mix. Their mission to help Russia optimize North Korean weaponry for the modern battlefield. While the West is already alarmed by these developments, China's reaction is equally surprising. As Russia's lifeline through sanctions, China has kept Putin's economy afloat and has quietly supported Moscow from the sidelines. But the idea of North Korean troops stationed so close to China's border could be pushing Beijing's loyalty to its limit. So what's really driving China's unease? Will this surprising alliance push Beijing to rethink its stance on the war in Ukraine? With Xi Jinping's next move a mystery, the stakes have never been higher. But why would China's leader be so alarmed by North Korean troops entering the picture? As it turns out, there are some big reasons, and they could change everything. First, the reports of North Korean soldiers on Russian territory suggest that Russia is willing to call on other countries for direct military aid in the war. Russia justifies this action by implying that these soldiers would only be used to reinforce the Russian border, rather than being deployed to the front lines in Ukraine. That would be in line with the June Mutual Defense Agreement between the two nations. The agreement states that the countries are required to come to the other's aid when their territory is threatened. For Russia, this only became an issue in August 2024, when Ukraine launched its invasion of the Kursk region. This was a major morale boost for the Ukrainians and seen as a strategic victory at the time. It showed that they could present a real threat to Russia's own territory, even with only the limited supplies of advanced Western military equipment that they had been provided. The Kremlin's response to the Kursk invasion started off relatively muted, with what seemed to be little progress in reinforcing the region during the 3 weeks when Ukraine was pushing deeper into Russian territory. The counteroffensive only started in September, nearly a month after Ukraine pushed into the region. Since then, like in Donbass, they've been grimly, steadily grinding the Ukrainians back. By the time that reports of North Korean soldiers arriving on the Kursk front lines started surfacing, Russia had regained control of roughly half of the occupied territory in Kursk. With the slow progress in Kursk, it does make sense to deploy more troops to reinforce the border, both to prevent new incursions and to stop reinforcements arriving in Kursk. However, in the bigger picture of the war, Russia has pushed on with its offensive in Donbass throughout the Kursk incursion. So these troops that would supposedly be set up on the border probably wouldn't end up doing much. Even if Ukraine did try to snag another bit of Russian territory, that's not likely to be their focus in the near future. Ukraine needs its manpower most in the Donbass region, where the Russian forces are pushing ever deeper into Ukrainian territory at a speed not seen since the very beginning of the war. Additionally, Russia has been conscripting soldiers through mandatory military service for more than 30 months now. Even if that military service lasts only a year, recent estimates suggest that the Russian military has conscripted roughly 160,000 new soldiers every 6 months. That's a reserve of 300,000 troops, and according to Russian law, conscripts can't be deployed abroad. This means that Putin already has plenty of his own troops to reinforce Russia's borders, unless those troops are not nearly as well trained as they should be. This is supported by interrogations of conscripts taken as prisoners of war in Kursk by the Ukrainian military. According to some recruits, they were given only a few weeks of basic training and then shipped to their posts. So the North Koreans should be better trained than Russian conscripts. After all, North Korea has an 8-year mandatory military service period for men and 5 for women. But there are a few issues with that assumption. Firstly, the troops from North Korea are unlikely to have been trained in modern combat tactics, including the long-range drone warfare that's become such a prominent feature of the ongoing war. That means that they are unlikely to fare much better than Russia's own conscripts in the grand scheme of the war. Secondly, there are doubts that North Korea would actually send their top troops to another country, regardless of any geopolitical pressure to defend Russia's territorial integrity. It's far more likely that the soldiers sent to Russia were meant to perform the same role as conscripts or fresh recruits in the Russian military so far – cannon fodder. So if the troops aren't going to make a significant difference, why is China not happy about them being there? Well, Putin's reasoning for calling these men to defend the Russian border doesn't really make sense logically. If they're only going to be called to defend the border, the West might decide to do the same thing in Ukraine. If NATO decided to send well-armed troops to Ukraine to honor the country's territorial integrity, this would have the same result as Putin's own moves. NATO and Ukraine, of course, don't have a signed mutual defense pact like Russia and North Korea do, so this would be a serious escalation. No doubt Putin would likely make more nuclear threats, but this would certainly be crossing yet another of the red lines that he has frequently drawn over the past 33 months. But if Putin decides that the soldiers from North Korea were not going to be stationed defensively, but used offensively inside Ukraine, then all bets would be off. With a third country officially joining the conflict, the special military operation would devolve into a war that could escalate through many countries and regions. We could see direct conflict between NATO and Russia, plus of course the North Koreans. If this were to happen, it would leave China with a difficult choice. China has had its own mutual defense pact with North Korea since 1961. If NATO attacked North Korea, it would be obliged to come to its allies' defense. If China doesn't join Russia in the expanded war, most experts believe Russia is pretty much bound to lose a non-nuclear conflict against the combined forces of NATO. If NATO were to conquer Russia, China would stand to lose out on the cheap Russian resources upon which it depends heavily. These include oil, gas, and other natural resources like drinking water, minerals, and timber, which all come from Siberia. The resource-starved industry and water-demanding population centers of northern China would plunge into crisis. But if, on the other hand, China does join the war, its economy might not be able to support the effort. The US holds control over the Strait of Malacca, through which most of the naval trade between China and Europe, Africa, and the Middle East must pass. If China entered the war, the US would likely be called upon to take control of the Far Eastern front of the conflict. Then, the war could propagate to include the other members of the Quad – Japan, Australia, and India. The US and its allies in the Indo-Pacific could in effect blockade China from accessing the Indian Ocean and might be able to block off other naval routes through the East China Sea. China would be left with land corridors only to trade with Central Asia and reach ports in the Middle East and Persian Gulf. There would be heavy sanctions and embargoes. Railroads and highways are quite easy targets for NATO. China's economy might quickly collapse, especially if the war dragged on. But there's a third option. China might go to war against Russia itself. While the two countries are for all intents and purposes full allies, they weren't on such friendly terms throughout most of history. During the 19th century, Imperial China lost huge swathes of its territory to other countries, Russia included. Today's region of Outer Manchuria, which makes up most of the eastern part of the Sino-Russian border and connects Russia to North Korea, was taken from China by Russia during that time. While China has not made official claims on the territory, recent maps by the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources have relabeled all major cities in Outer Manchuria with their historical Chinese names. Additionally, China has stated all international maps should use those names. So why is Outer Manchuria so important for China? Apart from being a natural extension of one of the most densely populated regions of China, Control of Outer Manchuria would open the door for China to take the entire Siberia and Russian Far East along with it. Due to the harsh conditions, Russia has relatively little control or infrastructure in the region, and it's sparsely populated. The two largest cities only have around 400,000 people each. But Outer Manchuria and Siberia are abundant in the natural resources that China sorely needs for its industry. Lake Baikal alone could supply the country with fresh drinking water for decades. When Chinese companies made plans to purchase the land surrounding the lake, the Russian government was forced to step in and pull the rug on the project amidst local protests. And that's exactly where the North Korean troops might come in. Rather than using them to defend Russia against Ukraine, Putin might use North Korea to create a buffer zone against China. With Outer Manchuria bordering North Korea, the logistics of transporting troops en masse to the region are significantly simpler than posting them in Kursk or other regions close to Ukraine. But why would North Korea agree to this? They have a mutual defense pact with China too, don't they? Well, while North Korea has been sending military equipment, including missiles and artillery shells to Russia, Russia has been sending food and other products to North Korea in response. The specifics of the trade between the two countries aren't published by either country, but trade appears to have grown considerably in recent years. On the other hand, China has become more critical of North Korea's provocative actions over the past decade. China has even expressed mixed feelings about the deepening ties between Russia and North Korea, citing concerns about the potential impact on regional security and its own relations with Pyongyang. So if North Korea has indeed grown heavily dependent on Russia as opposed to China in recent years, then it might very well decide that the risk is worth the reward, especially if it's being leaned on hard by Putin. And the North Korean military is anything but small. Thanks to its mandatory military service requirements, it's estimated that the country could draft around 8 million people in the event of a conflict. But even without these reserves, the active military personnel of North Korea is around 1.4 million people, which equals the size of the US's military and Russia's, if their numbers are to be believed. And with North Korea mobilizing, South Korea is likely to rapidly gear up its national defense capabilities too. Relations between the two are already as strained and tense as they have been in decades. At a minimum, South Korea would work against China on the same axis as Japan and the US, cutting off access to the East China Sea. That's why the North Korean troops in Russia are leaving China with no good options. Perhaps the best option is to wait and see what actually happens with these troops. According to some reports, some of them have already deserted their posts, using their deployment in Russia as an opportunity to leave North Korea entirely. But whatever happens, the mere presence of North Korean troops says something about the current state of the war. It suggests that Russia is starting to exhaust itself as a result of the war effort. For the past 2.5 years, China has been betting that Russia would win the war, at least eventually. By signing extensive and highly lucrative trade deals with Russia, China was able to gain much more from Russia being at war than otherwise. And when Russia won, China would reap the rewards of the former's expanded territory, population, and industry. It would be able to fuel its own industry and leverage Russia's access to showcase the waning influence of the West, thereby strengthening its own position in global geopolitics. But if Russia loses the war, there's no telling what might happen with its government. The alliance between Russia and China appears to be built around the strong personal relationship between Xi and Putin and their regimes. If Putin loses the war in Ukraine, he might be forced out of office, and the next government might decide to, or be compelled to, pivot back towards the West. This would be a mortal blow to the so-called equal, orderly, multipolar world that China is trying to build with itself at the head of the table. In the end, China might be thinking that Russia is finally starting to crumble, both externally and internally. If it were to collapse, it might be able to swoop in, take Siberia and its resources, and profit greatly. But if North Korea keeps defending Russia, then that plan might go out of the window, and China would be forced to keep supporting a failing nation, and that's not something that China would have much incentive to do. But what do you think? Will China take an official stance on North Korea joining the war in Ukraine? Ukraine's fierce defense has kept Russia at bay for over 2 years, but a new, darker chapter is unfolding. In a shocking twist, North Korea, the world's most isolated and dangerous regime, has joined the war, sending thousands of troops to reinforce Putin's crumbling forces. Now, Ukraine faces not just Russia, but another unpredictable and dangerous enemy on the battlefield. But how did we even get here? How has North Korea become involved in the conflict? And what does this dangerous alliance mean for the future of the war? In this video, we'll dive into these questions and more. Let's start with the arrival of North Korean troops. On October 16, 2024, the BBC released a report repeating claims from a Ukrainian military intelligence source that North Korea has sent a unit numbering 3,000 soldiers into Russia. That news sent shockwaves throughout the global community. Moscow and Pyongyang look like they've created a military alliance akin to a tiny NATO, and they're now working together to help Putin achieve his goals in Ukraine. At least that's how it appears to Ukraine. Russia, as is so often the case, has immediately dismissed the reports. Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov went on record to claim that no North Korean troops have entered Russia, and they certainly won't be entering Ukraine. This is not only British intelligence, it's also American intelligence. They report it all the time, they don't provide any evidence. Peskov's message is clear: the West is making up stories once again to cast Russia as the villain. Only they're not stories. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has already spoken about North Korea entering the war, with South Korea backing him up. It says a North Korean deployment in Ukraine is highly likely. It's not a question of when that will happen, it's more about how many soldiers North Korea is going to send. The BBC spoke to a source in Russia's Far East to confirm that the North Korean troops are arriving, and with that source claiming they had. The new soldiers were being stationed in a Urasisk military base just north of Vladivostok, though the source also claimed their numbers were absolutely nowhere near 3,000. Maybe fewer troops are arriving than anticipated, or maybe the 3,000 soldiers are being spread among different Russian bases that the source doesn't know about. Nevertheless, this is worrying news for Ukraine and its Western backers. The move, however many soldiers it involves, signifies that the military ties between Russia and North Korea are strengthening. And if it involves 3,000 today, who's to say that there won't be many thousands more in the future? It may already be more than 3,000. On October 10th, just a week before the BBC's report, The Guardian claimed that North Korea was deploying military engineers to help Russia target Ukraine with its ballistic missiles. A Ukrainian source claimed there were already dozens of North Korean soldiers behind Russian lines, many working in teams to support launcher systems for KN-23 missiles. If those missiles sound familiar, it may be because August 2024 brought with it reports that Russia had used this North Korean missile to launch a strike against Ukraine, with a KN-23 confirmed to have killed a father and his 4-year-old son. Maybe those engineers were part of the 3,000 soldiers North Korea sent later in October. Or it may be that North Korea has been sending people to help the Russians for far longer than anybody realized. Worse yet for Ukraine, the numbers may already be higher than 3,000 North Korean soldiers. A day after the BBC's report, the Lowy Institute dug deeper into the claims that North Korea is sending soldiers to Russia. It found that the Washington Post believes that several thousand North Koreans have not only arrived, but are receiving military training from Russia. It also covered a report from the Kyiv Independent in which a Western diplomat told the Ukrainian news outlet the number is actually far higher than 3,000. North Korea has sent 10,000 soldiers, though the diplomat couldn't provide any insight into who these soldiers were or what their roles would be in the Russian military. Whether it's 3,000, 10,000, or merely a few dozen fighters, nothing changes the simple fact. North Korea is sending active members of its military into Russia. Now Ukraine faces a war against two countries instead of one. With that understanding of what's likely happening, we come to another question: why? Why is Pyongyang sending soldiers to fight in a war that's thousands of miles away from its territory and likely has no obvious impact on the North Korean regime? The answer likely lies in something that happened back in June 2024. In that month, news emerged that Putin and North Korea's leader Kim Jong-Un had signed a cooperative military pact that included an interesting clause. Each side would be duty-bound to come to the aid of the other if it was attacked. If that sounds similar to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which ensures a collective defense is mounted by all of NATO's members if any one of those members is attacked, you'd be right. Russia appeared to have created its own mini-NATO, with a military power that shares its vision of what a non-Western guided world could be. The pact naturally signaled alarm bells in the West. Kim described it as an alliance, with the world being left to speculate what this pact could really mean for the future. The Guardian suggested it cleared the way for Russia and North Korea to exchange technology and weapons. It noted that US intelligence believed Russia was already sending ballistic missile and nuclear submarine technology to Pyongyang, with North Korea having already been confirmed to be sending weapons to Russia. There was even talk of nuclear weapons, with the Biden administration apparently being concerned that Russia was going to help North Korea make the final push toward arming its submarines with nuclear warheads. All of this talk of technology transfers led to the cooperative defense aspect of the pact being swept under the rug. And why wouldn't it be? In June 2024, Putin's special military operation was contained in Ukraine. There was no suggestion that the war would extend into Russian territory, as Putin's red lines appeared to be holding strong. Then came August, and everything changed. On August 6th, Ukraine launched a small invasion into the Russian oblast of Kursk. Russia claimed to have put down an incursion that involved around 300 Ukrainian soldiers and a handful of tanks and armored vehicles, but those reports ended up being false. Ukraine had successfully overrun Russia's border defenses. It was advancing into Kursk, taking territory along the way, and Putin appeared to be doing nothing about it. 2 weeks into that incursion, Russia has been forced to evacuate around 200,000 people from the oblast as Ukraine moved deeper in. Now, Ukraine is at least 18 miles into Russian territory, with its soldiers having taken 93 villages and settlements while controlling around 460 square miles of Russian territory, around double what Russia has taken in Ukraine between January and August 2024. At the time, many in the international community saw the Kursk invasion as a massive gamble that paid off for Ukraine. Zelensky now had a hefty bargaining chip for future negotiations with Russia and, more importantly, from a war psychology perspective, he'd shown Putin and his people that the war Russia's leader began could arrive on his own country's territory. Ukraine only seems to have grown bolder in the months since. On September 10th, news emerged of another attack on Russian territory. This one wasn't focused on an out-of-the-way oblast that Russia's most affluent citizens could ignore. Ukraine struck Moscow, along with several other Russian territories. The attack lasted for an entire night and saw Ukraine launch 144 drones at its enemy, in the largest strike of its kind Kyiv had attempted since the war began. The drone attack forced over 50 flights to be diverted away from Moscow and killed at least one person. Ukraine also used its drones to destroy portions of high-rise buildings and even flew them directly over some of Putin's presidential palaces in a move clearly intended to remind Russia's leader that Ukraine had the means to hurt him in the city where he feels most safe. Again, this attack was a victory for Ukraine. It had crossed the biggest red line of all, striking Russia in its own territory. The problem is that what's happening in Kursk and Ukraine's Moscow strike may reveal why North Korean soldiers are now arriving in Russia. Think back to the pact Russia signed with North Korea in June. Each is now obligated to come to the other's defense if they face an attack on their own territory. That's exactly what the Kursk invasion was to Russia. Putin is one to play around with semantics. He'll happily ignore the 2.5 years of Russia invading Ukraine to point to the Kursk incursion as an attack on Russia. And North Korea, duty-bound by the pact it signed, is coming to Russia's aid in the same way that all NATO countries would come to the aid of one of their allies. The Kursk invasion opened up a military can of worms that nobody, least of all Ukraine, expected. It was as much an invitation for North Korea to get involved in the war as it was a successful invasion that took Russian territory. The more conspiratorially minded among you may even posit that Putin allowed the Kursk invasion to happen so he could lean on North Korea to supply soldiers. Russia's border defenses were weak, and Putin still doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot to push Ukraine out of Kursk. Maybe Russia's leader planned all of this from the start. That's probably giving Putin too much credit. After all, for as worrying as the news is about North Korea sending thousands of soldiers into Russia, it's hardly the first example of the two countries cooperating. Even before they signed their pact, North Korea was sending weapons and people to Russia. In February 2024, Al Jazeera reported on the South Korean Defense Ministry's claims that North Korea has sent up to 6,700 containers carrying millions of artillery shells and other munitions to Russia since September 2022. Those containers don't come for free, claims South Korea. Russia has been exchanging food, raw materials, and parts for the shells. Shin Won-sik, the South Korean defense minister, believes that North Korea has used these containers to deliver over 3 million 122mm artillery shells, or possibly around 500,000 152mm shells. It could possibly be a mix of the two, Shin claimed, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent. He also claimed that North Korea's artillery production facilities are running at full swing for Russia, even as munitions factories elsewhere in the country dropped to 30% of their typical output due to a lack of raw materials. Time magazine expanded on these claims in June 2024, around the same time that Russia and North Korea signed their defensive pact, with Shin saying the number of containers was then closer to 10,000. South Korea's defense minister also said, Putin is expected to seek closer security cooperation with North Korea, especially military supplies such as artillery shells that are necessary to seize a chance to win. A sign of desperation from a Russian leader quickly running out of weapons? Perhaps. But this mass transfer of artillery shells shows us that Ukraine has been fighting North Korea indirectly for most of 2024. The arrival of North Korean boots on the ground in its territory seems to be a natural expansion of the deepening defense relationship between Russia and its more fervent ally. You can also add the KN-23 missiles we spoke about earlier into the mix. The great irony appears to be that Russia, once one of the world's top weapon manufacturers, now has to rely on a country many perceive to be much weaker to keep its military stocked up. North Korean manpower arriving in Russia also isn't as new an occurrence as it seems. In April 2024, The Diplomat published a piece claiming that in January 2023, North Korea started sending people into the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine's Donbas region. Those people weren't soldiers, They were workers, the diplomat claims, who arrived to help Russia start rebuilding the infrastructure it had spent 2 years destroying. Still, the arrival of these North Korean workers was worrisome for Ukraine, as it showed Putin was coming up with ways to overcome Russia's labor shortages. Ship in workers from another country, and Russia is able to send more of its own people into the Ukrainian meat grinder. Again, an indirect example of the alliance between Russia and North Korea. But it's also yet another stepping stone to where we are today, as North Korean soldiers are slowly trickling into the country to fight on Russia's behalf. Zelensky now has to face up to a truth that he may not have wanted to confront before. Ukraine is no longer at war with Russia alone. It's also fighting North Korea. Let's take a step back and examine what that might mean for Ukraine as Putin's special military operation moves into 2025. North Korea is far from a military powerhouse in the same way as Russia. Global Firepower, or GFP, which ranks 145 of the world's military nations annually based on their military strength, says North Korea is 36th out of 145. Not a bad ranking for sure, but nowhere close to Russia at second in the rankings or Ukraine at 18th. The country's weaponry is certainly nothing to write home about. As Business Insider pointed out in September 2023, even the artillery shells and missiles North Korea has sent to Russia so far are of generally poor quality. The UK former ambassador to North Korea, John Everard, highlighted this, saying that most of the weapons Russia has received from North Korea are in very poor condition. But condition may not be the main factor here. As long as North Korea's artillery shells explode, Russia isn't going to be too bothered where they land, as long as they hit Ukraine. The numbers game is more important, and if there's one thing North Korea can provide to Russia, it's more of what it needs to continue its bombardments. Coming back to GFP's statistics, it points out that North Korea has 3,215 tanks, which is the second most tanks of any military nation. Those tanks won't be as much use to North Korea when fighting against Ukraine given they're thousands of miles away. But if Pyongyang can find a way to ship those tanks to Moscow along with soldiers, Russia suddenly has a whole new fleet of metal monstrosities it can field in Ukraine to supplement Putin's already tank-heavy strategy. North Korea's navy, though 505 ships strong, isn't going to be much use either. The vast majority of those ships are patrol vessels, and even if North Korea sent ships over, they wouldn't get anywhere. Entry into the Black Sea is blocked by Turkey, which is why Russia hasn't been able to supplement a fleet that's lost a third of its ships to Ukrainian missiles and drone strikes. North Korea also has a decent number of aircraft, with an air force that ranks 11th in the world for its sheer number of assets, at 476 planes and choppers. But again, Russia really isn't using its air force beyond launching glide bombs from behind the front lines, and it has plenty of planes of its own. So how can Russia use North Korea to fight against Ukraine? The simple answer is people. A lot of people. North Korea's military has 1.32 million active personnel, placing it fourth in the world for sheer manpower, and putting its military on par with Russia's when it comes to how many people it contains. The country also has 560,000 reserve soldiers and 100,000 paramilitary fighters, and it's here that Ukraine faces a serious problem. North Korea's troops are likely poorly trained, they may even be under-equipped, but they come in heavy numbers, and if there's one thing that Putin has shown us during the war, it's that he's willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of people to achieve his objectives. Ukraine going to war with North Korea will result in thousands more North Korean soldiers arriving in Russia, ready for Putin to send into his meat grinder. The first 3,000 to 10,000 being reported are likely just the beginning. North Korea may send tens of thousands more because it views a Russian victory in Ukraine as a win over the Western hegemony that both Russia and North Korea want to eliminate. And so we come to another question. With North Korean boots set to go on the ground in Ukraine, exactly how does Russia intend to use its new influx of soldiers? The Kyiv Independent fielded some opinions in the wake of its own reports that 10,000 North Korean troops had arrived in Russia. First, it quotes UK's former defense attaché to Moscow, John Foreman, as claiming that the disclosure that North Korean troops may appear on the front line is a direct consequence of catastrophic Russian casualties. Again, it's Putin's meat grinder approach at play. Foreman believes that the arriving North Korean soldiers offer questionable military effectiveness at best, meaning they will be cannon fodder for Ukrainian defenders. Therein lies our first clue to Putin's approach. He's not looking for talented military operatives. The North Korean soldiers aren't specialists that he can use to conduct any sort of complex operations within Ukraine. They're bodies he can use however he sees fit. And the odds are high that the thousands of North Koreans arriving in Russia are going to be treated similarly to many of Russia's conscripts and contract soldiers. They'll be sent to the front lines to absorb Ukrainian bullets. There's a twisted logic to this approach, with Russia using its soldiers to slowly whittle away at Ukraine's ammunition supplies, essentially eroding its defenses rather than overcoming them with superior military tactics. The approach also demonstrates how little either Putin or Kim care for the lives of their own people. North Korea's leader likely knows that he sent thousands of soldiers to die. He'll probably send thousands more, and he'll know that being fed into Putin's meat grinder is all they're really good for and won't even miss the lost soldiers. After all, North Korea has mandatory military service. The entire country is heavily militarized, with all North Korean men being duty-bound to serve in the country's military for 10 years, while women have to serve for 8. Article 86 of the country's constitution even says, national defense is the supreme duty and honor of citizens, which essentially sets North Korea's people up to die at the behest of their leader for any military goal Kim can imagine. Christoph Bluth, who works as a professor of international relations and security at the University of Bradford, agrees with this opinion. He claims that North Korea can provide just two things to Russia. One is cannon fodder, he says, with the other being the massive arsenal of ammunition dating back to the 1950s that North Korea has stockpiled for decades. It's that sort of ammunition that's been making its way into Russia for most of the war, particularly in the case of artillery shells. And given Putin's extensive use of Soviet-era equipment to fight against Ukraine, this ancient ammunition stockpile is actually far more valuable to Russia's leader than it would first appear. Bluth also assesses the quality of the North Korean soldiers heading into Ukraine. They spend a lot of time in the army, he says when referring to the decade-long national service most soldiers go through. But the quality of equipment they have and the quality of training are rather dubious. But let's dig deeper into the operational aspect of this soldier transfer. Just where does Russia intend to use its new North Korean soldiers against Ukraine? Kursk seems to be the most obvious answer. The Kyiv Independent says that the North Korean soldiers will likely go through a training period, after which they'll be sent to Kursk to defend against the Ukrainian incursion that began in August 2024. The BBC's James Waterhouse backs this opinion, noting that many of the 3,000 soldiers North Korea has sent ended up in Ulan-Ude, which is close to Russia's border with Mongolia and offers a potential path into Kursk. If this is the case, then perhaps Russia is using North Korean soldiers in the spirit of the defensive pact it signed with its ally. Maybe they won't end up in Ukraine itself, meaning Zelensky only has to worry about fighting them on the soil of the country Ukraine has invaded. That's likely not the case. Posting on the social media platform Telegram, Ukraine's counter-disinformation department leader, Andriy Kovalenko, says that Ukraine can't rule out the possibility that these North Korean soldiers will soon find themselves stationed in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. We may already be seeing that given the reports that state North Korean laborers are being sent to the Donbass. It's not a huge stretch to say that soldiers will follow. Putin's plan may be to use North Korean manpower to push Ukraine out of Kursk before sending those embattled soldiers, along with any others that Kim sends his way, to the front lines in Ukraine. Those cannon fodder soldiers also have no choice about whether they enter Ukraine. They already live extremely brutal lives, with the consequence of refusing the orders of their leader likely being long-term imprisonment or death. So it's clear that North Korean soldiers are likely to enter Ukraine sooner rather than later. Our next question is, how worried should Ukraine be about this? Right now, the numbers of North Korean soldiers in Russia don't shift the dial dramatically in Russia's favor, according to Foreman. Instead, it's more of a sign of Putin's desperation. Dr. Jenny Mathers of Aberystwyth University suggests Ukraine still shouldn't approach the situation flippantly. This could just be step one, she says. Let's send a small number, see how it works on both sides. Mathers also points out that integration is going to be key for Russia. The BBC says the same thing in its report about the 3,000 soldiers. The language barrier is going to be an enormous problem for the North Korean soldiers. They may be familiar with the weapons they're expected to use, and their country has even produced many of them, but they don't speak Russian. Yet they're expected to figure out how to work alongside Russian units while communicating effectively, which doesn't seem likely. One analyst stationed in Russia, who the BBC says doesn't want to be named, points out that Putin had enough of a problem with integration when he introduced Russian prisoners into his military. It wasn't even that easy to include hundreds of Russian prisoners at first, and those guys all spoke Russian. How are the North Koreans supposed to integrate when Russian speakers have so many problems? That's an issue upon which Ukraine will hope to capitalize, especially if it results in Russia's North Korean contingent launching uncoordinated attacks that make them easy pickings for the far more experienced and cohesive Ukrainian units stationed in Kursk. That's assuming the North Koreans fight at all. On October 16th, Newsweek reported that some of the initial wave of North Korean soldiers had already deserted. Russia is actively looking for 18 troops who were deployed in the Kursk and Bryansk oblasts, just 4 miles from Russia's border with Ukraine. Commanders are apparently trying to conceal the desertions as the search is ongoing. That's a massive and perhaps unforeseen problem for Russia. The North Koreans heading into Russia to fight against Ukraine aren't going there by choice. Kim is forcing them to go under the threat of harsh penalties. If these 18 desertions occurring right at the beginning of North Korea entering the war are anything to go by, Russia is going to have a difficult time coordinating attacks with these soldiers. We can speculate as to the reasons why these desertions happen. Maybe the North Korean soldiers saw the reality of the Ukrainian threat facing them and decided they wanted no part of the fight. An equally possible reason is that some of these North Korean soldiers see being sent to Russia as a potential escape route out of North Korea. They're no longer in a country in which their every action is monitored, and they're taking advantage of that fact by disappearing into the ether. What does that mean for Ukraine? This lack of cohesiveness, coupled with desertion, which is surely going to become more common over time, suggests that Ukraine will be able to handle the North Korean troops entering Russia right now. That doesn't mean it faces no danger. If North Korea starts sending tens of thousands more soldiers, Ukraine is going to have to fight against most of them, even if some defect. A lack of training and an inability to communicate may not even matter much to Putin, as long as he has bodies to throw at a conflict that's already cost Ukraine and Russia so much. Therein lies the issue for Ukraine. It's now at war with North Korea, albeit not in a traditional sense, and if Kim is as determined to see the completion of Putin's special military operation as Russia's leader is, then we may see this war extend into several more years before Ukraine can come out on top. But what do you think about North Korea sending soldiers for Russia to use against Ukraine? Is this an experiment that could result in tens of thousands more North Koreans being sent to Ukraine as part of Putin's meat grinder? How do you think Ukraine will react to this influx of new soldiers? Russia has made a big mistake. It's a mistake that looks like a major win for the country's President Vladimir Putin, at least on the surface. But it's also a blunder that looks set to bring new countries into his special military operation in Ukraine, leaving his beleaguered soldiers facing the prospect of fighting against even more powerful foes. What is that mistake? Saying yes when North Korea offered to send 10,000 soldiers to help Russia in its fight against Ukraine. The Pentagon says that's the number of North Korean troops that will arrive in Russia over the next few weeks to train and fight on Putin's behalf. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has already called this move a significant escalation in the Ukraine war that shows Putin's expansionist desires. But Russia's president couldn't have anticipated that his decision to work with North Korea could have consequences far outside Europe. Now, it's not just Ukraine with which he has to contend. Another country is about to enter the fray: South Korea. North Korea's greatest enemy has had enough of its neighbor sticking its nose in where it doesn't belong. South Korea is about to get involved in Putin's special military operation in a big way to force North Korean soldiers out of Ukraine. Keep watching this video to find out how Putin's blunder has changed the face of the Ukraine war. But first, the North Korean involvement. With over 10,000 North Korean soldiers flowing into Russia, the obvious question is, where are they all going? On October 31st, Al Jazeera reported that Kursk is their likely destination. The Russian oblast has been the subject of a Ukrainian invasion since early August 2024. Ukraine currently holds around 460 square miles of territory in Kursk, which includes up to 93 villages and settlements that it overran in the space of a month. Putin hasn't managed to dislodge those Ukrainian soldiers in the nearly 3 months that have followed the initial invasion. He needs more people. That's where North Korea comes into play. Al Jazeera says that the Pentagon has confirmed the entry of North Korean troops into Kursk. Pentagon spokesperson Pat Ryder says that there are a small number of North Korean troops in the Kursk Oblast, with a couple thousand more that are almost there or due to arrive imminently. This is actually a clever strategy by Putin. Those North Korean soldiers aren't going into Ukraine, meaning he can make the defense that he's only working with North Korea to push Ukraine's soldiers out of Russia's territory. Plus, he gets manpower to feed into what is likely to become a Kursk meat grinder, akin to the one he's created in Ukraine, without sacrificing his more experienced Russian soldiers. Putin has been bullish when pressed on the arrival of North Korean soldiers in his country. Speaking at a news conference toward the end of October, he said, "This is our sovereign decision," without directly answering the question of whether the soldiers had arrived. Putin claimed, "Whether we use it or not, where, how, or whether we engage in exercises, training, or transfer some experience, it's our business." Ukraine's allies aren't convinced that Russia won't use North Korean soldiers to attack Ukraine. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen echoed Mark Rutte's sentiments that Russia's move is a grave decision, before adding that the European Union, or EU, would respond together with our like-minded partners. South Korea is set to be one of those partners, but we'll get back to that soon. More worrying for Ukraine, and by extension South Korea, is the news that North Korean Foreign Minister Cho Sun-hui has touched down in Moscow for her second visit in just 6 weeks. The Singaporean news outlet CNA says few details are available about the nature of this meeting, but Cho will likely meet with Russian officials to discuss the possibility of North Korea sending even more soldiers to Russia. Again, Russia is protesting its innocence when it comes to Cho's visit. Moscow claims that discussions are taking place within a pre-established strategic dialogue framework. As is so often the case, Russia is being cagey over the specific purposes of its conversations with its allies. AP News speculates the meeting will be a high-level negotiation, with Cho offering more troops in exchange for certain benefits only Russia can provide. Could those benefits include technology that would help North Korea to advance its ailing nuclear weapons program? It's possible. Access to more advanced technology seems to be the key reason for North Korea allying itself with Russia. It all adds up to a worrying situation for Ukraine and South Korea. Seeing up to 10,000 North Korean soldiers flood into Kursk is a big enough problem. Ukraine is relying on holding that territory to give it a bargaining chip it can use against Russia if the two countries ever find their way toward peace negotiations. But the news of Cho's visit to Moscow brings with it the prospect of North Korea dedicating even more of its 1.32 million active military personnel to Putin's cause. Plus, Russia's caginess about the arrival of these North Korean troops and their purpose in the country means there's an ever-present threat that they may move beyond Kursk and fight Ukraine on its own soil. Still, Ukraine is going to do what it's done since Russia's invasion of February 2022 – fight with all of its might. On October 28, 2024, Lithuanian news outlet LRT reported that the first clashes between Ukraine and North Korean soldiers had already taken place in Kursk. That's according to Jonas Oman, who heads the Lithuanian Blue-Yellow non-governmental organization. Oman says that his sources in the Ukrainian armed forces say Ukraine had already killed the first North Korean soldier months before the 10,000 troops arrived in Russia. To my knowledge, the first North Korean was killed in Ukraine a couple of months ago by a drone handed over by Blue-Yellow, claims Oman. He also says that his contacts in the Ukrainian intelligence sector tell him they believe the number of North Korean soldiers heading into Russia could climb as high as 88,000. That's over 3 times more soldiers than those who serve in Lithuania's active military. The takeaway here is that North Korea is adamant about getting directly involved in Putin's special military operation. It already was long before the reports of the 10,000 soldiers came out, if Oman is correct. This is where South Korea comes in. When the news broke about North Korea sending soldiers to Russia, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol made his feelings known. Speaking at a summit meeting with Polish President Andrzej Duda, who was visiting Seoul, Yoon claimed his country would not sit idle in the face of North Korean provocation that threatens global security beyond the Korean peninsula and Europe. What does not sitting idle mean to South Korea's president? Extending his country's security cooperation with Ukraine is high on the agenda. CNA notes that Yoon has already spoken with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about North Korea's presence in Kursk. Both agree that Putin's special military operation has extended beyond Russia and Ukraine, becoming an internationalized battle in the process. So South Korea's first effort to get North Korea out of Ukraine involves sharing military intelligence and expertise. That's invaluable to Ukraine. No country knows the threat North Korea poses better than South Korea, as the two countries have been at loggerheads since the end of the Korean War in 1953. CNA believes that Ukraine is preparing to dispatch an envoy to South Korea to facilitate this intelligence sharing. Ukraine would get direct access to a South Korean spy network that keeps constant tabs on North Korea's actions. That alone could help Ukraine to react to any further cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang. But that's not all South Korea is doing. Intelligence sharing alone isn't going to result in South Korea kicking North Korea out of the Ukraine war. The country intends to do more to help Ukraine with its North Korean problem. That starts with changing the way it sends aid to Ukraine. South Korea has always been an ally of Ukraine. However, it stopped short of sending weapons and direct military aid to the country. Denton's reports that most of South Korea's aid comes in financial or humanitarian forms, with the country having committed $394 million to Ukraine in 2024. Approximately a quarter of that aid, $98 million, is earmarked to help Ukraine with the reconstruction of buildings and land that Russia's military campaign has devastated. $196 million goes towards serving Ukraine's immediate humanitarian needs, with some of that money also funding international organizations on the ground in the war-torn country. Add to all of this the $24 million South Korea has pledged to NATO's Ukraine Trust Fund for 2025, and it's clear that Seoul has previously supported Ukraine from afar. It sends money generously for non-military purposes, but it's not sending weapons or direct military aid. That may be about to change now that North Korean soldiers are in Russia and fighting against Ukraine in Kursk. During the same summit in which South Korean President Yoon claimed his country won't sit idle in the face of North Korean aggression, the prospect of sending weapons to Ukraine was raised. While we have maintained our principle of not directly supplying lethal weapons, we can also review our stance more flexibly depending on the level of North Korean military activities. This wasn't a direct confirmation that South Korea is preparing to send weapons to Ukraine, but it's telling that Yoon's comments came during a meeting with Poland's Prime Minister. AP News reports that Poland and South Korea have signed multiple arms deals over the last couple of years, with Poland purchasing howitzers, missile launchers and tanks. Perhaps Yoon is hinting at the possibility of indirectly supplying weapons by providing them to Ukrainian allies, who can then donate the weapons as intermediaries. Alternatively, Yoon may be hiding what South Korea has up its sleeve for the North Korean soldiers in Ukraine. The AP News report also notes that Yoon's comments about supplying weapons roughly align with similar statements made by an anonymous senior presidential official days before. That official claimed South Korea was in the process of considering its options, with those discussions including the possibility of sending both defensive and offensive weapon systems into Ukraine. South Korea sending weapons would be a boon for Ukraine. The Center for Strategic and International Studies says that South Korea produces around 200,000 155mm artillery shells annually, meaning it has plenty stocked up to feed Ukraine's howitzers and similar weapons. If South Korea is serious about kicking North Korea out of Ukraine, setting itself up as a consistent supplier of the shells Ukraine needs so desperately to defend its territory and attack Russian positions would be a good start. But something is standing in the way of South Korea supplying weapons to Ukraine: the country's laws. Speaking to the Kyiv Independent, Stimson Korea Program Director Jenny Town says South Korea has thus far avoided sending military aid to Ukraine, not as a matter of policy, but of law. The president can't just say, "Hey, I've changed my mind. Here's what we're going to do now." It really does require actual legislation to be passed. Yoon may lack the authority to push that legislation through, according to Town, due to his approval ratings in South Korea being just 24.1%. But it's equally possible that the South Korean people, so used to the ever-present threat from their neighbor, could see North Korea's entry into Russia as a reason to change the country's laws. Yoon may push for just that if North Korea sends even more troops to Russia. And that's not all. In addition to raising the possibility of sending weapons, however unlikely that may be from a legal standpoint, Seoul is also suggesting it may do something else to kick North Korea out of Ukraine: send South Korean troops to defend its ally. On October 22nd, the Kyiv Independent reported on the Yonhap agency's claims that South Korea is considering sending personnel into Ukraine to monitor the movements of North Korean troops. A source from the agency said, "There's a possibility that personnel will be sent to Ukraine to monitor the tactics and combat capabilities of North Korean special forces dispatched in support of Russia. Such a team may include intelligence personnel who could pass on information about North Korean military tactics to Kyiv. South Korean soldiers may also help Ukraine handle the interrogations of any North Korean soldiers it captures." So far, the concept of sending South Korean troops into Ukraine is speculative. There's no official word from Seoul, and even if there was, Yoon would face the same legal barriers he faces when it comes to sending weapons. Even so, the mere fact that such discussions are taking place in South Korea suggests a change in the country's approach is coming. Putin's special military operation is no longer a war taking place thousands of miles away from Seoul. It's evolved into a multi-country conflict that has dragged South Korea's biggest enemy into the fray. Yoon recognizes this. He also recognizes that allowing North Korea to work alongside Russia with no response could lead to his country's biggest enemy getting its hands on vital military secrets. South Korea needs North Korea out of Ukraine. If not to protect Ukraine, then to ensure North Korea doesn't benefit from information that could see it strengthen its military and make strides with its nuclear weapons program. If a change in South Korea's laws is required to make that happen, Yoon may start pushing for those alterations sooner rather than later. But what do you think? Is South Korea going to send weapons and soldiers to Ukraine? How else could Seoul tackle the Pyongyang problem? All friendships are over. Those are the words of a Lithuanian citizen named Darius when asked about what was happening between his country and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. His comments come in the wake of what LRT, or Lithuanian National Radio and Television, calls more symbols of separation between the Baltic state and its Russian-owned neighbor, with Darius going on to say that he had Russian friends when he was a child. Those friends even came to visit him in the Panamuna region, which is just across a bridge from Kaliningrad. Those friends aren't visiting anymore. And neither does Darius have any intention of crossing the bridge into Kaliningrad. The reason? Russian President Vladimir Putin's acts of aggression in Ukraine threaten not only the sovereignty of Ukraine, but also carry threats that Russia may attempt to take Lithuania if it's successful in its current war. As for the symbols of separation, they're actually far from mere symbols. They're preparations for war that many in Lithuania believe is coming. A war with Kaliningrad. But why is Lithuania gearing up to fight against the Russian exclave? What does all of this have to do with the war in Ukraine? And what might happen if Lithuania and Kaliningrad do end up fighting? Those are among the questions we'll answer in today's video. But first, we need to dig deeper into the fortifications that Lithuania has been putting in place to defend itself against Russia. In truth, those fortifications have been cropping up throughout 2024. On February 20th, 2024, just a touch under 2 years after Russia invaded Ukraine, LRT reported that Lithuania was putting plans in place to fortify its borders with Belarus and Kaliningrad. Their goal was to impede the movements of troops from two nations it now considers its adversaries, with the creation of around 20 counter-mobility parks being high on the agenda. These parks are essentially small patches of land that Lithuania intended to load with a host of defensive equipment, including concertina wire coils, reinforced concrete blocks, and Czech hedgehogs, which are anti-tank obstacles made using metal beams. Lithuania wouldn't be the only country taking these precautions. LRT noted that the other two Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, had agreed to take similar measures to protect their borders to create what the outlet calls a common defense line against Russia and its Belarusian ally. At the time, Lithuania didn't provide any details about where its counter-mobility parks would be, though the country's deputy defense minister, Zilvinas Tomkus, made special mention of the border with Belarus and what he called the Kaliningrad Strip. Tomkus also revealed that the government planned to spend 1.5% of its defense budget, amounting to nearly $35.5 million, on equipment for its counter-mobility parks in 2024. Fast forward to the end of July 2024, and we saw more examples of Lithuania preparing its border defenses. LRT reported that Lithuania had started to bolster its border defenses not only with the barriers mentioned in February, but also by building trenches and laying down minefields in preparation for a possible invasion from both east and west. Kaliningrad was a particular focus. Lithuania's border with the Russian exclave is already dotted with bunkers built during World War II, which were built by the Soviet Union just months before Nazi Germany invaded Russia. Those bunkers make up a portion of the Molotov Line, which stretches from the Baltic states to the Black Sea, and Lithuania, a former Soviet country, has 300 of those bunkers alone. Granted, the Soviet Union never equipped them with weapons or proper defenses. However, this means that in addition to its counter-mobility parks, Lithuania has a series of ready-made fortifications waiting for it to use. Many of these bunkers now sit disused, owned by whoever happens to own the land on which they sit, and the majority sit in what's called the Suwalki Gap, a 43-mile stretch of land connecting Lithuania to Poland and flanked by Kaliningrad and Belarus. Russia regularly threatens to seize or cut off Lithuania's access to this gap, so the odds are high that the Baltic state is going to look to revitalize these bunkers to reinforce its border defenses against Kaliningrad. All of this brings us back to September 2024 and Darius's comments about Lithuania and Kaliningrad no longer being friends. He made his comments while standing before the Queen Louise Bridge, which stretches over the Nemunas River to link Lithuania and Kaliningrad, while looking at the counter-mobility measures Lithuania has installed on it to prevent hostile vehicles from driving from Kaliningrad into the Baltic state. That bridge will eventually become home to 7 Czech hedgehogs, along with concertina wire and 80 dragon's teeth, which are pointy pyramid-like obstacles made using concrete and rebar that are laid along a road to prevent tanks from crossing over. More barriers could be built next to the bridge, LRT speculates, with various shoals and fords along the Nemunas River that Russian troops could use to cross into Lithuania having already been identified. The formation of obstacle courses at each of these locations would provide further border defenses, claims the Lithuanian armed forces, with each obstacle slowing Russian troops and making them targets for Lithuanian soldiers. But some other regions near Kaliningrad are also on the Lithuanian agenda. The country's Chief of Defense Staff, Major General Remigius Beltranas, says that various parts of Lithuania's border with Kaliningrad run overland, meaning they'll require different defenses than those deployed on the Queen Louise Bridge. There's also the Curonian Spit, a 61-mile sand dune that separates the Baltic Sea from the Curonian Lagoon, that needs to be considered. The Curonian Spit is a slightly different water obstacle, says Beltranas when comparing it to the Queen Louise Bridge. It has different access and planning. Beltranas claims that Lithuania's goal is to confront each potential crossing point from Kaliningrad differently based on the terrain, though all with the goal of enabling these installations to come together to form a single defense plan. It all adds up to a massive series of border defenses, costing tens of millions of dollars, that are designed to protect Lithuania from invasion via Kaliningrad. The next question is simple: why? There are several reasons, with the first having already been touched upon: Putin's threats. Russia's rhetoric around the Suwalki Gap is far from the first threat it's levied against Lithuania, with the Baltic states' ardent support of Ukraine during the war having prompted several more from the Kremlin. For instance, December 2023 saw Belgium's Chief of Defense, Michael Hoffman, describe both Russia's switch to a war economy in the wake of the Ukraine war and what this might mean for the Baltic states. The language used by the Kremlin and by President Vladimir Putin is always ambiguous. It's possible that they might open a second front at some point in the future, in Moldova or in the Baltic states, he claimed. There are several instances of this type of language throughout the Ukraine war. For instance, April 2022 saw The Guardian report that Putin had warned of the possibility of Russia turning nuclear weapons on the Baltic region if Sweden or Finland join NATO. Putin said that he would send nukes to Kaliningrad if that happened, though Lithuanian Defense Minister Arvydas Anušauskas was quick to point out that Russia already had nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, even though that claim hadn't been independently verified. Sweden and Finland have both joined NATO since these threats were made, and there's been no nuclear follow-through by Putin. Fast forward to February 2024, and Putin was making more nuclear threats, again aimed at the Baltic states, during his annual State of the Nation address. This time, Putin referred to reports that several NATO countries, including Lithuania, were considering putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Don't they get that? Putin claimed during the address. As of May 2024, Lithuania remained open to sending its soldiers into Ukraine if it felt the need. Come September 2024, Putin is again making threats. This time, he's telling Ukraine's Western allies that war may come if they allow Ukraine to use their long-range missiles inside Russia. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are fighting Russia, he claimed in what Politico dubbed a final bid to scare off Western nations from allowing the use of these missiles. While not directed at Lithuania specifically this time, the threats still add to the pile. After all, a Russian war with NATO means a war with Lithuania, given that the Baltic state is a NATO member. There is a clear pattern of intimidation at play here, albeit one that's yet to see Putin follow through on any of his threats. The Russian leader believes that he can use intimidation to corral countries like Lithuania into doing his bidding, or at the very least, force them to stay out of his special military operation. But all he's really succeeded in doing is convincing Lithuania that it's going to be a target of Russian aggression, which is one of the reasons we're now seeing it set up sweeping border defenses near Kaliningrad. Even before building its border defenses, Lithuania was responding to Putin's threats by standing up and becoming one of Ukraine's biggest supporters. In March 2023, The Conversation wrote that Lithuania was essentially spearheading both NATO's and the European Union's, or the EU's, efforts to face up to Russia. Frankly, the country has a long history of being brave in the face of adversity, the article argues. It adopted the slogan, "Lithuania, a brave country," in 2008, and has lived up to that moniker by directly opposing Russia and Belarus at various points since. In August 2020, Lithuania welcomed Sviatlana Tsihanovskaya following Belarus's fraudulent presidential elections, essentially protecting her from retaliation by Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko. The country is also being quick to welcome Ukrainian refugees, has provided funds to Ukraine's military, and even seen its Russian-speaking citizens phone Russian people to provide information about what's happening in Ukraine. Lithuania was also one of the first to adopt a resolution calling on the United Nations to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine following Putin's invasion, and it expelled Russia's ambassador from its capital city of Vilnius in April 2022. Simply put, Lithuania has been a political thorn in Putin's side for a long time. That's why the country takes the threats Putin spews more seriously than many other nations. It believes it understands the lengths of Putin's aggressive ambition, and it aims to protect itself against a potential invasion that may come as much in retaliation for its support of Ukraine as it may due to Putin's spats with NATO and the rest of the West. Some might even argue that Putin is already at war with Lithuania. He's just not waging that war in the traditional sense. Shortly after the beginning of the Ukraine war, Putin put his cyber-attacking teams to work to try and destabilize Lithuania's internal mechanisms. One such attack came toward the end of June 2022, albeit with the caveat of the claims by the group that conducted the attack that they weren't connected to Putin's government. That seems hard to believe though, given the attacks came just days after Lithuania had blocked Russian passage through the country, thus preventing it from reaching Kaliningrad by land. The attacks targeted Lithuanian media and transport websites, as well as sites owned by the country's tax service and similar state institutions. The tax service even had to pause operations for a period as the attack all but took out its website. The penetrator was a Russian group called Killnet, which claimed on its Telegram channel that the attack was due to Lithuania blocking access to Kaliningrad. Not state-sponsored perhaps, but certainly state-influenced, with Killnet clearly acting in the best interests of the Kremlin, even if it claims no associations. The Ukraine war has been marked by similar attacks ever since. Fast forward to February 3, 2024, and a pro-Russian hacking group was at it again. This time the target was Ilias, which is the Lithuanian Armed Forces distance learning system. The hackers, this time operating under the name Just Evil, claimed to have hacked not only Lithuania, but the rest of the Baltic states and the US. Lithuania essentially confirmed the hack, noting that it had tracked a suspicious login to Ilias and, for this reason, 3 servers of the State Telecommunications Center hosting the Ilias training system have been disabled. It appears no data was leaked in this attack, but it's likely no coincidence that the attack came just a couple of weeks before Lithuania announced its plans to shore up its borders with Belarus and Kaliningrad. You also have to wonder why Just Evil would target a Lithuanian army training system. Is it just hitting any target it can find? Or is it trying to get information on how Lithuania trains its armed forces, so that Russia and Putin will know what it will be up against when fighting erupts between Lithuania and Kaliningrad? Those questions have yet to be answered, but what is clear is that pro-Russian groups, whether they're directly associated with the Kremlin or not, are carrying out attacks that benefit Putin's ambitions. The Russian president may not have overseen these cyber attacks directly, but it's difficult to see how he wouldn't benefit from them, as they're part of a concerted campaign to destabilize and intimidate Lithuania. Speaking of intimidation, we come to another reason why Lithuania is preparing for war with Kaliningrad. Russia appears to be boosting Kaliningrad's military presence. In late August 2024, several weeks into Ukraine's Kursk invasion, Microsoft's Start reported on Russia's continued attempts to control the Baltic Sea and the entire region. Specifically, it noted that Raimundas Vaiksnoras, who serves Lithuania as its Minister of National Defense, had claimed to have seen a buildup of military activity in Kaliningrad. Interestingly, these military actions may not be what you expect. Vaiksnoras says that Lithuania has noted several troop movements since the beginning of the war, starting with soldiers previously stationed in Kaliningrad being transferred to various areas in Ukraine to wage Putin's war. However, the Minister of National Defense said most of those soldiers returned to Kaliningrad after their Ukraine war rotation. Granted, there had been a significant reduction in these ground forces, likely due to deaths experienced on the Ukrainian front lines, but the fact that they have returned sparks concerns for Lithuania. Even with ground troop reductions, Vaiksnoras points out that Lithuania can't become complacent. He claims that the region still contains several A2AD air defense systems, allowing Kaliningrad to control the airspace over the Baltic Sea if needed. There's also the missile problem to consider. CNA, which conducts national security analyses, claims that Russia operates a Baltic fleet of warships that's 52 vessels strong, with 4 of those ships being Steregushi-class corvettes armed with cruise missiles. Many of the ships in this fleet dock in Kaliningrad. The oblast may also have an extensive collection of land-based missiles, which include anti-ship weapons like the Onyx P-800, with a range of up to 210 nautical miles. Add several dozens of Russia's Iskander nuclear-capable ballistic missiles into the mix, each of which has a range of 300 miles and can easily reach anywhere in Lithuania from Kaliningrad, and you have plenty of reasons for Lithuania to be concerned. Finally, there's the history between Lithuania and Russia to consider. After all, Lithuania was once part of the Soviet Union. After a brief period of independence that began in November 1918 in the aftermath of World War I, Lithuania faced an almost immediate threat from the Soviet army. Russia invaded in January 1919, with the Red Army occupying Vilnius to oversee the installation of a new Soviet government. Lithuania fought back to the point where it had pushed the Soviets out by the midpoint of that year, but the threat was clear. The Soviet Union wanted to own Lithuania. The next 20 years saw the Baltic state join the League of Nations and attempt to establish its official borders. Unfortunately for Lithuania, World War II came along in 1939, as did the secret protocols of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact signed between Germany and the Soviet Union in August 1939. Originally, the pact would have seen Lithuania fall under German control following the war, with Hitler actively courting the country to join in on his attack on Poland. Lithuania instead opted to remain neutral, forcing a revision to the pact that would instead see it fall under Soviet rule if Germany won the war. Lithuania had no idea this pact existed, and it didn't really matter. The Soviet Union made its intentions clear in October 1939 when it forced the Lithuanian government to accept a treaty of mutual assistance, essentially paving the way for Soviet influence to creep into the country. By June 1940, Moscow was demanding that Lithuania install a friendly government while allowing the Soviet Union to admit an unlimited number of troops into the country. constitutional violations followed, the Soviet Union managed to take control of staged elections and, on July 21, 1940, Lithuania's newly installed Soviet-approved government was requesting that the country be incorporated into the Soviet Union. Moscow happily accepted its own request to take control of Lithuania. There were hiccups. The peace between Germany and the Soviet Union didn't last, with Germany successfully overrunning Lithuania in mid-1941. Not long after Germany launched its attacks against the Soviet Union, the German occupation led to the mass extermination of Lithuania's Jewish community, leading to the country losing 250,000. The Soviets then retook control toward the end of 1944, organizing its own sweeping deportations, with 70,000 Lithuanians being displaced in 1947, followed by another 70,000 in May 1948 and some 80,000 in 1949. It would not be until the fall of the Soviet Union that Lithuania would regain its independence, with the country holding its first post-Soviet elections in 1992. The point here is that Lithuania knows all too well what it means to be an unwilling subject of Russian rule. And given that Putin has indicated that the restoration of the old Russian Empire is one of his key goals, and a large part of the reason for his special military operation in Ukraine, it's no surprise that Lithuania is concerned. Putin would see it as a part of that empire, especially given the old Soviet ties, providing yet more reason for Lithuania to be shoring up its defenses against a possible invasion via Kaliningrad. In truth, Lithuania has been trying to separate itself from any aspect of Russian influence for years. We've already seen several examples in this video, including its barring of Russian land access to Kaliningrad and its steadfast support of Ukraine. Both actions are part of a concerted effort to de-Russify the country. April 2023 saw Lithuania pass a series of amendments that tightened the sanctions it had already implemented on Russian and Belarusian citizens in the country. The new bill made it impossible for Russians to apply for citizenship or buy real estate in Lithuania for a year, in addition to suspending applications for temporary residence permits. The measures were extended in 2024 and came amidst Lithuania having received 75,000 Ukrainian refugees since the start of Putin's special military operation. The message is clear. Lithuania doesn't want any Russian influence in its country. That message was reinforced in May 2024 when the country banned Russian and Belarusian observers from monitoring its presidential elections, stating that both countries merely wanted to spearhead campaigns that pose a threat to our national security. The move was a big departure from the convention, as Lithuania is a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, which typically sends teams made up of observers from multiple nations, Russia and Belarus included, to ensure the legitimacy of elections. Lithuania extended an invite to OSCE members, except the aggressor Russia and its supporter Belarus, claiming both were threats to Lithuania's entire political model. Further de-Russification came in June 2024, when Lithuania extended its law on the provision of information to the public, which bans the online distribution and retransmission of Russian and Belarusian television and radio programs. Again, Russia's ongoing military campaign in Ukraine was given as the reason, likely with a healthy side helping of Lithuania ensuring the country couldn't do anything to influence its decisions to defend itself from a possible Russian invasion. All of which brings us back to Kaliningrad. Lithuania has a historical precedent that shows why Russia is likely interested in invading its territory, and it's taken note of the Russian military buildup in Kaliningrad and the threat it could pose. Now we come to an important question. How do the militaries in Lithuania and Kaliningrad compare? We can determine the strength of Lithuania's military with the help of Global Firepower, or GFP, which ranks 145 military nations annually. GFP says that Lithuania ranks 88th out of the 145 nations, placing it close to the midpoint of the rankings. It only has 23,000 active military personnel, though these numbers are bolstered by the 104,000 reservists, who are the result of the country putting mandatory military service in place for all men aged between 18 and 23. It also has a drafting system in place that applies to all men between 18 and 26, meaning that any war with Kaliningrad would likely spark a mobilization that sees Lithuania's active military swell in numbers to the tune of several tens of thousands. The country also has 14,150 people serving in its paramilitary forces, which aren't official parts of Lithuania's military but would likely fight alongside it to repel Russian soldiers from Kaliningrad. The problems for Lithuania come from its lack of equipment. Its air force has only 9 assets, almost all of which are fixed-wing transports, with a further 4 helicopters. Its navy isn't much better, featuring just 11 vessels, including 4 patrol vessels and 4 mine warfare ships. Practically no competition for the powerful Russian Baltic fleet mentioned earlier. Lithuania's land forces fare a little better. Though the country's troops have no access to tanks, they do have 1,356 vehicles, along with 54 units of towed artillery and 21 self-propelled artillery units. Nevertheless, Lithuania is far from a military power, which offers another reason why it's working so hard to secure its border with Kaliningrad. A good early defense will help it to mobilize while slowing Russia's forces down. As for Kaliningrad, it's difficult to get clear numbers. The Hill says that Russia was estimated to be keeping 30,000 soldiers in Kaliningrad before the war, roughly matching what Lithuania has available. But many of these soldiers have been moved around during the special military operation. Several thousand of those troops have also been sent into Kursk to defend against the recent Ukrainian incursion, meaning Kaliningrad may actually have fewer soldiers than Lithuania at the time of writing. Where the oblast comes out on top is in the equipment race. We've already mentioned the presence of the Baltic Fleet and the huge numbers of missiles believed to be stored in Kaliningrad. It's also known that Russia at least sends combat aircraft into the exclave, if not actively storing them there. February 2023 saw a team of Dutch F-35s intercept several of these craft within Polish airspace, with a similar incident occurring in April of the same year that saw UK and German Typhoon fighters intercepting Russian craft over the Baltic region. There are a few definite numbers. Still, it's safe to assume that with its combination of missiles, aircraft, and the Baltic Fleet, Kaliningrad would hold advantages over Lithuania both aerially and at sea. As for tanks, the numbers are again uncertain, though the Russian military analysis blog claimed in March 2021 that Kaliningrad has almost 190 tanks, most falling under the command of the 11th Army Corps. So Kaliningrad has the advantage in ground equipment too, though Lithuania's border defenses may make it difficult for Kaliningrad to make that advantage count. The odds are that Kaliningrad would win if it were to face Lithuania alone. The problem for Russia is that alone isn't going to happen. There's one huge factor that could prevent Putin from launching an invasion of Lithuania via Kaliningrad: Lithuania's NATO membership. It, along with the rest of the Baltic states, is protected by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which duty binds all of NATO's members to come to the aid of any NATO ally if it's the victim of an armed attack. It's an all-for-one and one-for-all approach that would see all of those other 31 members of the alliance come to Lithuania's aid if Kaliningrad is attacked. Those allies include much of Europe, including military powerhouses like France, Poland, and the United Kingdom. And of course, the US is a NATO member, meaning a Russian invasion of Lithuania via Kaliningrad would be tantamount to Putin declaring war on his greatest foe. After all, the main reason for Ukraine's allies having only provided military funding without sending soldiers is because Ukraine isn't part of NATO. Lithuania is a different prospect for Putin. If he's hell-bent on returning Russia to its empire days, he has to accept that this would mean declaring war on NATO nations, thus incurring the collective wrath of a host of other countries. The final question is simple. Would Putin still send troops from Kaliningrad into Lithuania? The Baltic states certainly believes it's a possibility. There's enough military equipment in Kaliningrad to present serious problems for the Lithuanian military, which is why the country is investing so heavily in its border defenses. Putin has also made plenty of threats about war with NATO during the Ukraine war, suggesting that this is at least a possibility for which Russia's leader is preparing. If nothing else, Lithuania is determined not to be caught unaware. If Kaliningrad invades, Lithuania is going to be ready to fight back. But the war would likely be the first conflict in a much wider war that engulfs the rest of Europe and, possibly, the entire world. But what do you think? Is Lithuania right to be wary of a potential Russian attack via Kaliningrad, or is Putin at least smart enough to know that such an act would essentially be a declaration of war against all of NATO? As the war in Ukraine drags on, now past the 2.5-year mark, the truth about Russia's staggering losses is becoming impossible to ignore. While the Kremlin stays silent, the mounting graves across Russia tell a chilling story. In 2023 alone, Russia has spent $2.5 million expanding cemeteries, a grotesque sign of the war's true human cost. This isn't just a statistic, it's double what was spent in 2022 and 6 times the amount in 2020. But the real horror is what's still to come. At the current rate of death, experts predict Russia's troop losses will surge to 1 million by 2025. Think about that, 1 million soldiers gone. The last time a single nation saw such devastation was during World War II, a cataclysm that reshaped the world. Now Russia is hurtling toward this grim milestone in a war Putin refuses to stop, dragging his country deeper into the abyss with every passing day. So how has it come to this? How did one of the world's most feared military forces turn into a machine that consumes its own soldiers faster than it can replace them? And how long can Russia continue throwing men into the meat grinder before it collapses entirely? When you wage a futile war with brutal intensity and reckless persistence, the relentless slaughter of soldiers and civilians becomes an inescapable reality. Here's how Russia's President Vladimir Putin has driven his country and his people toward this devastating milestone, reminiscent of history's darkest years. As of August 28, 2024, Russia has lost precisely 618,960 troops in Ukraine, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. This figure includes both fatalities and soldiers who've been so severely injured on the battlefield that they're no longer able to serve. If you're wondering about the proportion, The Economist reports that for every Russian soldier killed in action, there are roughly 3 to 4 wounded. A leaked document from the US Department of Defense leaves room for an even higher number of losses. According to this document, between 462,000 and 728,000 Russian troops have been killed, injured, or captured in Ukraine since the invasion began on February 24, 2022. That's substantially more troops than Putin initially prepared for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with 190,000 soldiers moving into Ukrainian land on that fateful February day. These staggering figures make one thing abundantly clear. Ukrainian soldiers are making the invader pay heavily for every inch of ground gained, even if they're paying quite a high price in the process too. However, whether it's 600,000 or 728,000, this figure is still a few hundred thousand soldiers short of 1 million. So how exactly could the projected loss of Russian troops reach this mind-blowing figure in a relatively short period? To answer this question, all we need is some simple maths. Let's use these figures presented by the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, as it's been publishing daily reports about the situation on the Ukrainian front line. Relying on these reports, we'll see how many troops Russia lost in a single week in Ukraine. As we mentioned, the last available report prior to writing these words was on August 28th. On this date, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces put the total troop losses at 611,190 soldiers. Let's go back to August 21st to examine the trajectory of the Russian troop losses in a single week. On August 21st, the report published by the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces stated that Russia had lost 603,010 troops since the beginning of its invasion of Ukraine. The very next report, republished on August 22nd, put the total number of lost soldiers at 604,140. This means that in a single day, Russia lost 1,130 of its troops. This figure slightly increased the following day, as the August 23rd report pointed to a total loss of 605,330 troops. That's another 1,190 soldiers lost in a day. The next day showed a similar single loss day, with a reported 1,160 casualties. With this number, Russia lost a total of 606,490 troops. From August 25th to 27th, the total number of lost soldiers increased by 2,420. This means that the figure of 610,100 lost soldiers was reported on August 27th. On the last day prior to writing the script for this video, August 27th, Russia lost another 1,090 soldiers, leading to the 611,190 figure we mentioned a few times. So in total, that's 8,180 soldiers lost in a single week, or an average of 1,168 troops per day. Now let's say this loss rate continues uninterrupted. At an average of 1,168 troops lost per day, the staggering figure of 1 million casualties would be reached within 332 days, on July 26, 2025. If we use the figures coming from the US Defense Department as a starting point and keep the same loss rate, it will only take Russia 232 days to have 1 million of its soldiers wiped from the battlefield. This gives us the grim milestone of April 17, 2025. That's pretty much on par with the predictions of various experts, including Michael Clarke, a British academic who specializes in defense studies. In his interview with Times Radio, a British digital radio station, Professor Clarke claimed that Russia's troop losses could even reach 1 million by the end of 2024, given how little Putin cares for the human cost of his devastating military campaign. The new Chief of the General Staff of the British Army, General Sir Roland Walker, has laid out even more pessimistic forecasts for the Russian troops. General Walker believes that Putin will sacrifice between 1.5 and 1.8 million people in total to achieve his military goals in Ukraine, which is seizing the 4 primary regions or oblasts: Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. His exact words were, "At the current rate of attrition of dead and wounded, that puts Russia probably well north of 1.5 million casualties to take the 4 oblasts in Ukraine, with untold billions of lost equipment." He also pointed out the absurdity of such a colossal human cost for a strategic aim that increasingly seems both unreachable and irrational. As General Walker put it, there have got to be more things for Russia to worry about than losing the best part of 1.5 to 1.8 million people for a slice of Ukraine with the way the world is going. Unfortunately, as things currently stand, it doesn't seem like it. In fact, it seems that Russia isn't particularly worried about losing all these troops either, although to be fair, the numbers coming from the Kremlin tell a whole different story. The only time the Kremlin publicly acknowledged its troop casualties was in early 2023, and the figure reported was almost insulting in its inaccuracy. At the time, the Kremlin claimed a mere 6,000 Russian soldiers had been killed in Ukraine, a figure that starkly contrasted independent estimates suggesting numbers tens of thousands higher. The disconnect between the official Kremlin figures and the actual losses on the battlefield only deepens the sense of tragedy, as the true scale of human suffering remains hidden behind propaganda and misinformation. Luckily, some Russian independent media outlets have taken great risks to report more accurate figures. As soon as the shameful 6,000 figure came out, Mika Golubovsky, an editor with the now banned Media Zona, immediately disputed it. Closely working with BBC Russia and relying on new graves in Russian cemeteries and open-source information from official reports, newspaper, and social media, Media Zona reported that over 50,000 Russian troops had died in Ukraine. That's 8 times more than what the Kremlin had claimed. Despite the inherent danger of challenging the official narrative in Russia, Golubovsky and other journalists continued their brave reporting. On July 5, 2024, both Media Zona and another independent media outlet, Meduza, published that approximately 120,000 Russian troops had died since the start of the invasion. That's pretty much on par with the figure that the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces reported at the time. The July 5th report from the staff put the total figure of killed and injured soldiers at 548,580. Using the deaths to injured ratio proposed by The Economist between 1 to 3 and 1 to 4, this suggests that between 109,716 and 137,145 Russian troops have been killed in action. Thanks to a slip-up from December 2023, it's safe to assume that Putin is well aware of the true scale of Russian troop losses, but he simply doesn't care. As Yevgenia Chirikova, an exiled Russian environmental activist, puts it, the growing number of killed and maimed on both sides does not bother Putin at all. Until Russian troops receive a tough rebuff in Ukraine, no changes will happen. But if Putin is so indifferent to this staggering human cost, why not just report it accurately? Why not use it to rally the nation around a narrative of sacrifice and patriotism, painting the war as a heroic struggle for Russia's survival? Well, this type of spin would have been possible some tens of thousands of dead soldiers ago. Now, reporting actual figures can only backfire, revealing the full extent of the disaster that Putin's regime has tried so hard to conceal. But wait a minute, shouldn't the Russian people be well aware that their friends, family members, and neighbors are dropping like flies in Ukraine? Well, they are. But that's people outside Russia's 2 largest cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. You see, Putin has been very careful not to conscript people from these major cities. Why? Because this way, he shields the urban elite from the direct impacts of the war, preventing a potential backlash from those who have the power to question and challenge his decisions. Additionally, not drafting young men from Moscow or St. Petersburg has caused many wealthy Russians to return to these cities after previously fleeing them to avoid the draft, thus offsetting the economic damage done by Western sanctions. But if Muscovites aren't the ones dying on the Ukrainian battlefield, who is? Who makes up the bulk of the hundreds of thousands of Russian troop casualties? To put it simply, they're troops that the Kremlin doesn't care about. Contract soldiers, foreigners, convicts, reservists, they're the ones filling the ranks and bearing the brunt of the casualties. As far as contract soldiers, or kontraktniki, as they're called in Russia, go, they receive little sympathy from the public or the Kremlin. After all, they chose to enlist and are well paid for their service. As Sergei Krivenko, a human rights activist from Moscow, puts it, ordinary people do not feel particularly sorry for them. And judging by the measures implemented by the Kremlin, Putin doesn't either. In May 2022, the 40-year age limit for contract soldiers was abolished, allowing applicants up to the age of 65 to enlist. Now you might wonder, why would anyone in their 60s willingly head to a conflict zone? The answer lies in the desperate economic circumstances faced by many Russians. For some, the prospect of a well-paying contract job in the military becomes a lifeline amidst financial hardship. In this regard, the broadening of eligibility reflects a grim calculus. When the cost of war becomes unsustainable, the Kremlin is willing to pull from increasingly desperate or less privileged demographics, prioritizing immediate military needs over long-term human costs. To make this brutal calculus possible, the Kremlin has been offering a monthly salary of at least $2,300. To put this figure into perspective, you need to know 2 facts. One, the salary of a contract soldier before the war in Ukraine was around $360. And two, the national average income in Russia is roughly $900 a month. And that's in regions that are better off. In poorer regions, it's half of that, $450. Throw the one-off recruitment bonus of at least $2,200 and high payouts in the event of disability, $33,000, and death, $55,000 into the mix, and it becomes clear why the Kremlin's offer is so tempting to those in desperate financial straits. That's also why the Kremlin is constantly hiking up the target figures for kontraktniki. In March 2020, Russia had approximately 405,000 of these soldiers. This figure was expected to rise to 500,000 by 2027. But then Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, so the target figures dramatically increased, while the time frame for achieving them significantly shortened. In December 2022, it was announced that 695,000 contract soldiers would be serving in the Russian armed forces by 2026. A year later, in December 2023, the number was increased to 745,000 troops by 2027. Even with all the incentives, it's easy to see why these figures are unlikely to be met without significant strain. That's why the Kremlin resorted to another shameful tactic, coercing individuals who might otherwise have never volunteered for service. In this sense, the war in Ukraine has started to resemble the Chechen wars, which were primarily fought by forced conscripts. As Kravchenko puts it, these soldiers were sent to slaughter, which caused tension and backlash in society, even to the point of creating social movements. However, the Moscow elites are unlikely to launch any sort of social movements for the bulk of the troops coerced into conscription. Why? Because these are primarily made up of foreigners and convicts. According to numerous media reports, foreigners have been coerced to join the ranks of the Russian armed forces in one of three ways. First, they were deceived about the nature of their prospective employment. Second, they were promised Russian citizenship after only a year of service. Third, they were found guilty of breaking Russian law and given the choice between serving a prison sentence and serving in the war. The first disgraceful way is how a 21-year-old from Sri Lanka found himself on the Ukrainian battlefield. He joined the Russian armed forces for the second reason, receiving Russian citizenship, and was told he would only be employed in a non-combat role. Instead, he was thrust into the front lines, far from the safe, supportive role he'd been promised. That's how he ended up wounded and captured in Ukraine, which is why he also decided to share his story with DW, a German state-owned broadcaster under the watchful eye of Ukrainian military personnel. When he was first sent to the outskirts of the Russian-occupied Ukrainian city of Donetsk, he told his commander that he wanted to return to Sri Lanka. However, he was told that doing so could land him in prison for 15 years per the contract he had signed. So he stayed put, together with dozens of other citizens from India, Kyrgyzstan, Nepal and Tajikistan, all of whom were similarly trapped and betrayed by the Russian military's duplicitous promises. Besides false promises, the Kremlin also showed it had no problem changing the rules of the game whenever it felt like it. Before the war, foreign military recruits had to complete a 5-year contract in the armed forces to obtain Russian citizenship. Once Russian soldiers started dying in bulk, this period was reduced to only 1 year of service. But here's the kicker. Sure, they will receive citizenship after a year, however they'll still have to continue serving, as Putin stipulated that contracts of all kontraktniki will remain valid until the end of his so-called special military operation in Ukraine. During this period, no contracts can be cancelled, and all of those about to expire must be renewed. In other words, foreign fighters don't get to start over in a new country, they get to die as Russians. Russian convicts went through something similar. Initially, the Kremlin was recruiting convicts by promising them a pardon after serving for 6 months, even if they had been convicted of the most violent crimes. However, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the rules changed. The only way for most of these convicts to receive a clean slate was to serve until the end of the war in Ukraine. Also, for many of them, a full pardon was off the table, with only a reduction in their sentences or some other form of leniency being offered. Now, some might see this as just, as people who committed heinous crimes shouldn't be allowed to escape their past so easily. However, the fate of these individuals should be viewed in a greater context. Their situation shows just how easy it is for the Kremlin to exploit the power it inevitably holds over those in desperate circumstances. These prison recruits have not only been thrust into a perilous conflict under false assurances, but they've been practically used as cannon fodder in a war that offers them no real chance of survival or redemption. Ever since Putin ordered the now late Yevgeny Prigozhin to start recruiting prisoners in June 2022, these inmates turned soldiers became prime meat for the Kremlin's grinder. According to the BBC, the inmates recruited by Prigozhin survived in Ukraine for an average of 3 months. Those recruited by Russia's Ministry of Defense after its rift with Prigozhin survived for only 2 months on average. Though several conclusions can be drawn based on the difference between the two figures, the only one that matters is that both the ministry and the Wagner Group, previously led by Prigozhin, treated convicts as nothing more than an expendable force to be thrown into battle. As one soldier who wasn't part of the storm platoons made up entirely of convicts puts it, "Storm fighters, they're just meat." This brings us to another crucial aspect to discuss. How are all these tens of thousands of soldiers dying in Ukraine? By now, the number one way Russian troops are being killed in Ukraine is probably obvious: the infamous meat grinder military tactic. And if that name isn't graphic enough for you, let's paint a clearer picture. The meat grinder refers to the brutal, attritional approach where waves of soldiers are sent into fiercely contested areas, often under relentless artillery fire and close-quarters combat. This strategy is designed to wear down the enemy through sheer numbers and reveal its firing positions, but it comes at a horrific cost. After employing this strategy in the second year of the war in Ukraine, the Russian body count increased by nearly 25%. However, Russia also scored some significant victories in Avdiivka and Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. While helping Russian armed forces to capture Bakhmut in the spring of 2023, the Wagner Group lost 22,000 of its soldiers due to this merciless tactic. And that's where the problem lies. The semblance of success has only added more bodies into the meat grinder. The worst part, the Kremlin is so blinded by these fleeting triumphs that it continues to perpetuate this devastating tactic in Kharkiv, even though it's already proven unsuccessful in the region. The meat grinder tactic also failed in the Battle of Vuhledar, which is still being waged in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. According to the Institute for the Study of War, these ineffective human wave-style frontal assaults have been unsuccessful in the city due to challenging terrain, a lack of combat power, and failure to surprise Ukrainian forces. From this quote alone, two more elements that have been sowing death among the Russian troops become apparent: the lack of combat power and the mighty Ukrainian forces. As far as the first element goes, there have been numerous reports that Russian troops are sent to the front with insufficient training and equipment, and that's putting it lightly. The BBC reports that some of the prisoners recruited for the war in Ukraine had to beg their relatives to buy them proper uniforms and boots. And if the Russian military can't provide something as basic as adequate gear for its troops, it's hardly surprising that they are woefully equipped with inadequate weapons and munitions. According to Vladimir Grubnik, a Russian war supporter and blogger, many soldiers were sent to combat with rifles unsuitable for modern warfare. Others received broken rifles, which can't be either repaired or replaced. Throw the lack of a proper kit and medical supplies into the mix, and you'll understand the shock in Grubnik's words. What a foot soldier should do on the front line without a first aid kit, a spade to dig a trench, and with a broken rifle is a big mystery. You might recall the famous quote, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." Right about now, let us stop you there. The soldiers fighting for Russia in Ukraine can barely call themselves that. The only thing that sets these individuals apart from regular people is a fortnight of military training, if that. There are no professional and highly skilled soldiers fighting for their country anymore. No, they're already dead. Now there are only poorly trained individuals recruited with a single goal in mind: to send as many soldiers to the front line as quickly as possible. And what will happen to those soldiers at the front line? That isn't Putin's concern. His only concern is the figures that he can use to boast about Russia's might, but the world sees right through this propaganda. In a statement released on July 12, 2024, the UK Ministry of Defense slammed this approach as ineffective. The statement said, "Although this new approach has increased pressure on the front lines, an effective Ukrainian defense and a lack of Russian training reduces Russia's ability to exploit any tactical successes despite attempting to stretch the front line further." Again, there's the crucial element that has led to many Russian soldiers perishing: an effective Ukrainian defense. Ever since Kyiv didn't fall in a matter of days as initially predicted, one thing became abundantly clear: Ukrainians aren't going down without a fight. And let us tell you, they might be sacrificing a lot, but they're also taking numerous Russian soldiers with them. Telegram, the messaging platform prevalent in Russia, is often flooded by desperate accounts of the surviving Russians about how their units are being terrorized by Ukrainian drones, machine guns, and artillery. However, the Kremlin is known to adapt and overcome, and recently it came up with a new idea of how to locate and neutralize Ukrainian forces, showering them with fire. And to no surprise, this approach involves sacrificing more soldiers. But this time it's not waves of soldiers being sent in to overwhelm a specific position. This time, small detachments of troops are dismounting from their vehicles and advancing on foot toward the Ukrainian firing position. And no, this isn't some kind of Mission Impossible approach where precision and stealth rule the day. Instead, these soldiers are relentlessly pushed forward to essentially be sacrificed in an effort to locate the Ukrainian firing positions and hit them with artillery. Now, Russia might have substantially more citizens than Ukraine, but it still can't keep up this horrific strategy forever. The staggering loss of life and the constant need for fresh recruits are taking a toll, revealing the limits of a strategy built on sacrifice and brutality. For now, the Kremlin is effortlessly feeding the meat grinder with fresh meat on a regular basis, recruiting up to 30,000 new soldiers a month. But soon the pool of available recruits will dwindle, and the brutal reality of the conflict will come crashing down, leaving the Kremlin to grapple with the consequences of its unrelenting and deadly tactics. Putin is seemingly well aware of this fact, which is why the Russian armed forces are pushing quite hard to make real progress before they run out of time. But the lack of troops isn't the only thing holding them back. The Russian armed forces have also tried to apply pressure everywhere all at once during their summer offensive, causing them to stretch their resources thin and fail to achieve any sustained gains. In a month or two, the weather will also join the fray, further complicating their efforts. Once the heavy rain starts and the ground gets wet, the muddy terrain will become treacherous for both infantry and vehicles. This will not only hamper movement, but also make it difficult to execute any effective combat operation, which the Russians struggle to do even without the rain. And of course, there's always the fact that Russia is gradually plateauing its arms production, leaving the military with fewer resources to replace destroyed munitions and equipment. The relentless pace of the war in Ukraine, combined with sanctions and production bottlenecks, means that the Kremlin's war machine isn't as self-sustaining as it once was. The front lines are practically eating through military stockpiles faster than they can be replenished, forcing Russia into a dangerous reliance on outdated, Soviet-era weaponry and fragile foreign supply chains from China, North Korea, and Iran. In other words, Russia isn't only running out of soldiers, it's running out of everything. No matter how many men Putin throws into the fire, the war is bleeding the country dry. Still, the troop losses are undoubtedly the most tragic and horrifying reality of all. Each new conscript is sent to the front with less training, fewer supplies, and dwindling hope. Russia's war machine, once feared, now consumes its own people faster than it can replace them. These soldiers aren't just losing battles, they're being swallowed whole by a war that has no end in sight. And the most terrifying part, as more lives are sacrificed, nearing the 1 million mark, the Kremlin continues to push forward, turning a blind eye to the devastation and leaving nothing but a wasteland of broken men and shattered families in its wake. But what is your stance on these soldiers? Do you see them as victims of a ruthless regime or mere instruments of war, complicit in their own destruction? And when do you see the 1 million troop mark being passed? By the end of 2024 or sometime during 2025? It has been dubbed the largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine so far. On August 26, 2024, while still licking his wounds following the humiliation of the Kursk invasion, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a concentrated missile and drone attack that struck several cities in Ukraine. ABC News called it a nightmare strike that targeted 15 regions in the country, with Russia launching at least 127 missiles and 109 drones during an 8-hour attack. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky labeled the attack dastardly, while pointing out that Russia was once again using its missiles and drones to hit civilian infrastructure. By the end of the strike, at least 7 people were dead and another 47 injured, with 4 of those 47 being children, according to Ukraine's state emergency service. Still, it could have all been so much worse. The reason it wasn't is that Ukraine was able to defend against this missile and drone attack not only with the air defense systems it's used since the beginning of Putin's special military operation, but with a weapons platform that Zelensky has long said Ukraine needed. A weapons system that's capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky and over time may help to put Ukraine on a more even footing with Russia in the aerial battle. We're talking about the F-16. As well as being the day in which Russia launched its largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine, August 26th also marked the first time that Ukraine used F-16s to fight against Russia. In this video, we're going to provide a full analysis of how Ukraine used its new multi-role fighters, what its plans for the F-16s are likely to be in the future, and the challenges it still faces in establishing any form of aerial superiority over Russia. But first, a recap. Since the beginning of the war, Zelensky has argued that American-made F-16s could play a huge role in helping Ukraine turn the tide. The planes, he believed, would allow Ukraine to create small pockets of air superiority over Russia's enemy, particularly when used as part of combined ground operations, as Ukraine attempts to seize back territory Russia had snatched from it. But Zelensky was made to wait, and wait. In July 2023, several countries including Norway, Denmark, Belgium and the Netherlands formed a fighter jet coalition through which they pledged to deliver 85 F-16s to Ukraine. That might give you the impression that Ukraine received these fighter jets in 2023, but that wasn't the case. Before those planes could be sent to Ukraine, its pilots needed to undergo an extensive training program to learn how to use them. After all, these are pilots who have traditionally used older Soviet-era platforms, such as the MiG-29, and it would take them months to get up to speed on the F-16. The American multi-role fighter traditionally has a training program that lasts for 18 months. Even with that training being fast-tracked into a 6-month program, it would still be a long time after the coalition commitment was made before the F-16s would arrive in Ukraine. "It's been 18 months and the planes have not reached us," Zelensky proclaimed in July 2024, adding that he believed having F-16s would help Ukraine to unblock the skies over his country. The good news for Zelensky was that he wouldn't have to wait much longer to get his hands on F-16s. On August 4, 2024, Zelensky stood at an unnamed airbase in Ukraine, flanked by 2 of the first batch of 6 F-16s the country had received. "F-16s in Ukraine, we did it," he said during the ceremony, in which he thanked the coalition leaders who had made this possible while stressing that Ukraine would need many more. Those extra F-16s will come. It's believed Ukraine will have received 20 of them by the end of 2024, with another 65 waiting in the wings. But these first 6 will go some way to boosting Ukraine's air force so it can move away from the old Soviet systems upon which it's been forced to rely. Fast forward a little over 3 weeks and we arrive at August 26th and Russia's nightmare missile and drone attack. It was time for the F-16s to show what they could do. Sandbox News provided details about how Ukraine is using its F-16s in its August 27th report on Russia's missile and drone strike. It noted that of the 127 missiles and 109 drones that Russia sent to Ukraine, the vast majority were intercepted or shot down before they reached their targets. Ultimately, 102 Russian missiles were downed, along with 99 of the 109 drones. Ukrainian anti-air defenses were credited with the majority of these interceptions, but Sandbox claims that reports were coming in that Ukraine had deployed its F-16s for the first time, with those multi-role fighters taking part in a defensive effort that saw them shoot down several cruise missiles that were on their way to Kyiv and other locations. From there, the report became more speculative. Sandbox revealed that it wasn't known how many of its F-16s Ukraine had deployed in this defensive role, or exactly what types of missiles the planes had shot down. It notes that it's very unlikely that the F-16s were used to take out ballistic missiles, such as the Iskander-M, as their flight profiles make them difficult for the F-16 to counter. Instead, Sandbox says, it's much more likely that these F-16s played a part in taking down the bevy of surface and air-launched cruise missiles that Russia threw into Ukraine. It points to the Russian KH-101 and K-59, both of which it says operates more like tactical aircraft than ballistic missiles when they're in the sky. These missiles are powered by jet engines, similar to those used in older jets, giving them a heat signature for the F-16's missile systems to track. Because of those jet engines, the missiles also fly at lower altitudes and take a more horizontal flight path than ballistic missiles. However, the fact that they top out at speeds of between 600 and 700 miles per hour means they have no real means of defending themselves against a fighter jet that can fly faster and track them via their engines. Add to this that Ukraine has already revealed that the F-16s they've been showing off were seemingly loaded with air-to-air munitions, such as AIM-120B missiles and Sidewinder missiles capable of using infrared targeting, and it's clear that Ukraine intended to use its new planes as air defense assets. That's precisely what it appears to have done during Russia's extensive missile and drone attack, with the F-16s being used to take out cruise missiles, while Ukraine's other ground-based anti-air defenses focused on the ballistic missiles and drones. Sandbox says it's most likely that Ukraine was using AIM-9M Sidewinders, which have a range of around 10 miles, meaning any plane firing them would have to get up close and personal with a target. Given that F-16s can fly at speeds of up to 1,345 miles per hour, as well as reaching cruising speeds of 577 miles per hour, it's very feasible that Ukraine used them to track, catch, and then obliterate these types of Russian cruise missiles Sandbox notes were used in the attack. It's even possible, though perhaps unlikely, that Ukraine took advantage of the M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon built into the F-16. These 6-barrel cannons can rattle off an impressive 7,200 rounds per minute, with the caveat being that they're only really effective when the F-16 is within 2,000 feet of its target. They may have been used, though they would have required a pilot to get very close to a cruise missile, creating the risk of a debris cloud upon contact that could damage the F-16. Still, from all of this, we gain some insight into how Ukraine is using its F-16s. This initial batch, at least, appears to be a supplement to the country's aerial defenses. The F-16s weren't deployed on or behind the front lines and have yet to be used by Ukraine in combined efforts with ground-based soldiers. Instead, they're taking out missiles intended for targets on the ground in Ukraine, with their likely focus being to take out cruise missiles that Ukraine's ground-based anti-air systems can't track. A second missile and drone attack, launched just 2 days after the Nightmare attack, offered more insight. Sadly, it also showed just how much risk an F-16 pilot takes whenever they climb into the cockpit. According to a report by the Task and Purpose YouTube channel, Russia launched a second missile volley at Ukraine on August 29th. This one wasn't as large as the Nightmare attack, as it involved just 5 missiles and 74 drones fired at Ukrainian power generation facilities. However, Ukraine responded by sending an F-16 to take out as much as it could. That's when tragedy struck. The F-16 sent to take out the missiles and drones was piloted by Colonel Alexei Mess, who Politico says had long been a fervent advocate of delivering advanced fighter jets to Ukraine. On August 29th, Mess, who went by the handle Moonfish, was piloting one of those very jets during an aerial battle that saw him tackling the Russian missile and drone assault. He didn't make it. In a statement released by the Ukrainian Army General Staff, it was revealed that Moonfish had enjoyed some early success against the Russian missiles, shooting down 4 of them using his F-16's airborne weapons. Following that success, Moonfish, who was one of the first Ukrainian pilots to qualify to fly an F-16, encountered difficulties. During the approach to the next target, contact with one of the aircraft was lost. As it turned out later, the plane crashed. The pilot died, read the statement. Ukraine has yet to confirm if Moonfish was shot down or whether it was issues related to pilot or mechanical errors that led to his F-16 crashing. Whatever the case may be, the sad fact for Ukraine is that it's lost both a good pilot and one of the 6 F-16s it's received in the initial delivery, leaving it with just 5 until the next batch comes along. It was a difficult incident for the country, though it came tinged with a minor success. Moonfish had managed to destroy 3 attack missiles and 1 attack drone before his plane crashed. When combined with the much greater success achieved when dealing with the Nightmare strike that came 2 days prior, it's clear Ukraine is starting to figure out how to use its F-16s to turn the tide of battle against Russia. All of which brings us to a key question. What have we learned so far? Speaking to the Ward Carroll YouTube channel, Professor Justin Brink, a senior research fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, says that these early engagements show Ukraine is taking a cautious early approach with its F-16s. So far, we're not seeing a huge amount of what the Ukrainians are doing with the F-16, which in many ways is quite encouraging. It suggests they're being fairly cautious with them. It suggests that they're probably concentrating on working out and practicing the dispersed operation model, said Brink. This early caution is smart on Ukraine's part, as it means it's tempering the elation of finally having F-16s with the reality that only had 6 of them as of the creation of this video. So it's deploying them in a limited defensive manner. There are no confirmed uses of the F-16 near the front lines, which Brink points out is a far more dangerous use. They're also not being used to support the Kursk invasion, meaning Ukraine is either still working on the best strategy for a more offensive deployment, or it's biding its time until more of the promised 85 F-16s arrive in the country. Of course, these early engagements aren't risk-free, as we saw with Moonfish, but Ukraine choosing not to use its F-16s on the front lines right now means it believes the jets are best used in isolated engagements, which brings us to their current air defense role. Task and Purpose points out that the F-16 Ukraine lost wasn't flying near Kursk, and it wasn't lost near the borders where active fighting is taking place on the ground. This shows that the early assessments of their usage are correct, with Ukraine preferring to use its F-16s in an air defense role, meaning they will likely play the part of interceptors for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, the same channel also points out a side benefit of this interception strategy. Noting that there are only so many interceptor missiles to go around in Ukraine, Task and Purpose says that F-16s can more easily take out missiles and drones thanks to their advanced sensors, which frees up a lot of the older platforms to tackle riskier missions near the front lines. It sounds counterintuitive, but there's also a logic to this approach. Ukraine's pilots are far more experienced in flying Soviet-era jets that make up the majority of its air force. They know how to get the most out of them, says Task and Purpose, meaning Ukraine can use them to offer close air support to ground troops and conduct harassment missions, while the F-16 patrols the skies over Ukraine, ready to intercept any incoming missiles and drones. This approach also enables some level of training. After all, Ukraine's current F-16 pilots have only undergone around 6 months of training for a platform that usually requires 18 to master. By taking the more cautious approach of using F-16s as missile interceptors, Ukraine's pilots can cut their teeth on less dangerous targets, according to Task and Purpose. Perhaps the strategy is to gain greater familiarity with the platform in the short term, which will enable Ukraine's pilots to use F-16s in riskier frontline missions once the country has received more of its promised stock. That future looks brighter too, thanks to the F-16 opening up a whole new arsenal of weapons for Ukraine to use. Task and Purpose note that having Western jets at its disposal means that Ukraine now has access to the advanced weaponry developed by NATO that it previously was only able to jerry-rig into its Soviet-era jets. The channel points out that Ukraine's jets were forced to use R-60 infrared missiles and R-27 semi-active missiles during the early stages of the war, as those were all that were available, as well as being the only types of missiles the jets could use. Both missiles were developed in the 1980s, making them around 40 years out of date, and they resulted in Ukrainian pilots not having long-range capabilities. Compare that with Russian pilots who are using R-77 active radar missiles, and you see why this is so important. The R-77 has fire-and-forget capabilities, meaning the pilot can pull the trigger on the missile and then move away as the missile tracks its target. Ukraine's missiles required its pilots to keep the noses of their planes pointed at their targets, meaning they couldn't pull away to evade fire. That's all changed with the arrival of the F-16. The jet is capable of firing the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, which offers both fire-and-forget and beyond visual range capabilities, with many calling it one of the best active radar missiles in the world. It has a range of over 20 miles and can move at supersonic speeds before delivering a blast fragmentation warhead to a target. With missiles like these, Ukraine doesn't just achieve parity with the weapon systems used in Russian jets, it exceeds them. As more F-16s arrive in Ukraine, it's likely that we will see more of the jets making their way to the front lines to more directly engage Russian jets in the skies. That could change the entire complexion of the war, as F-16s could tackle the planes Russia is using to launch glide bombs and take out targets on the ground to enable advances by Ukrainian soldiers. However, that type of strategy is likely being reserved for the future, when Ukraine is more capable of unleashing the full potential of its F-16s. For now, it's going down a more defensive route, which brings us back to Ukraine's current usage of the F-16 as an interceptor. It's been making the jet even more capable of carrying out its role by implementing new defensive systems. Task and Purpose examined the F-16s that were on display during Zelensky's August 4th announcement of their arrival and noticed that they had new pieces of kit installed beyond their missile systems. An examination of the jet's pylons revealed that some of them looked bulkier than they should, with one even looking like it had small vents and a camera lens installed. That's the combination of pylon-integrated dispensing systems and electronic combat integrated pylon systems, Task and Purpose said, adding that they are additional defensive models created to improve the F-16's survivability. With these systems, Ukraine's F-16s can use jammers capable of spoofing the radar signals enemy missiles produce, preventing them from locking onto their fighter jet while it's in the air. The systems are even powerful enough to confuse ground-based anti-air systems, as well as larger aircraft. Add an AAR-60 missile warning system to those pylons, which uses ultraviolet light to detect the exhaust plume an incoming missile produces, and you have extensive defensive capabilities. Those capabilities will prove essential as Ukraine continues to use F-16s in an interception capacity. They'll also prove vital should Ukraine ever send its F-16s into direct combat with Russian fighters on the front lines. By now we're getting a clearer picture of the Ukrainian strategy. It's using F-16s to intercept missiles and drones for now, all while preparing its pilots for a future in which it has more of those aerial platforms available, which may allow it to run more advanced operations closer to the front. Even if that future doesn't come to pass, the use of F-16s may free up Ukraine's Soviet-era aircraft to operate on the front lines in safe knowledge that the F-16s are protecting key Ukrainian military installations. And there's more. Returning to Justin Bronk's conversation with Wade Carroll, Bronk says that Ukraine has been attacking Russian air bases with large missile salvos already. By bringing F-16s into those strikes, Ukraine develops a greater chance for success, which will put more pressure on Russia to evacuate its air bases, relieving pressure on Ukraine in the process. Ukraine can potentially try and blend missile and HIMARS attacks to create this pressure, Bronk claims, which will result in Russia pulling more of its jets further back. Not only does this lower the risk of Russia sending glide bombs and its own jets into Ukraine, but it also creates space for Ukraine's F-16s to operate on the front lines with less risk of encountering Russian fighters. Even if Russia goes down the opposite path and creates layered defenses at its air bases near the front lines, Bronk claims, that will mean offering less defensive capacity to troops and installations that are actually on those front lines. Again, that would create opportunities for Ukraine's F-16s, allowing them to operate at lower risk as they'll face fewer defenses. This creates a win-win situation for Ukraine. Risk is lowered either because Russia is pulling back, which also helps Ukraine's ground troops, or it's lowered because Russia's frontline defenses are sent to its air bases, giving the F-16s more room to operate. Again, this is likely a strategy for the future. Ukraine will need to receive more than the number of F-16s promised to it to make this pressure tell. All of that brings us to the ultimate goal Ukraine wants to achieve with its F-16s: preventing Russia from gaining or retaining air superiority. As faltering as Russia's efforts to gain this superiority have been, given that it's lost 368 planes and 328 helicopters already, it's at least been able to rely on its aerial might from behind the front lines. Glide bombs are launched from bases Ukraine can't reach, for instance, allowing Russia to rain explosives down on Ukrainian targets with little recourse. Brink says the foreseeable future of Ukraine's F-16 strategy is not to gain air superiority, it's to prevent Russia from gaining air superiority. With Brink noting that even with its full fleet of F-16s, Ukraine will still be facing a Russia that has a fleet somewhere in the region of 350 genuinely modern and capable fast jets that are individually at a technical level significantly more capable than the F-16 in most metrics. So Ukraine's goal is to be capable of defending its skies rather than using its F-16s to operate with impunity over the front lines. That's an achievable goal that, if Ukraine realizes it, will relieve the pressure placed on its key military installations and troops on the ground. With his aerial options restricted, Putin will be forced to either waste more of his missiles and drones on strikes, cutting into his already dwindling supplies, or simply send more soldiers into a war that's already cost Russia over 630,000 military personnel. In the end, it's about imposing cost, argues Brink. That's seen in the Kursk invasion and the long-range missile and drone strikes Ukraine has used against Russian energy facilities and its Black Sea fleet. Ukraine's new F-16s are likely going to become an extension of that strategy. They'll cost Russia valuable missiles, while helping Ukraine simply not lose the war long enough for its other strategies to really add up, to the point where Putin may have to pull out based on cost alone. Still, there's one thing that's being underestimated when it comes to Ukraine's use of the F-16: the impending arrival of the Saab 340 aircraft. In May 2024, Sweden announced that it would donate 2 of its Saab 340s to Ukraine, in a move that flew somewhat under the radar. With all the hubbub about Ukraine receiving F-16s, Task and Purpose suggests that the arrival of these planes could be a real force multiplier in terms of how Ukraine is able to leverage its F-16s. Why? Because it's a radar aircraft that's capable of spotting incoming threats before the F-16 systems can locate them. An F-16 without being backed up by this type of radar aircraft is like shooting a rifle without an ACOG, or Advanced Combat Optical Gun Sight scope, says the channel. The Saab 340 will serve as that scope. Though it's essentially a twin turboprop plane, the Saab 340 comes with a high-tech radar system and the ability to communicate the data it retrieves directly to an F-16 in the field. So the Saab 340 will track incoming missiles and similar threats at extremely far distances, allowing it to send tracking data to the F-16s so they can eliminate the threat. The arrival of the Saab 340 will reinforce Ukraine's use of the F-16 as an interceptor, making it far more effective than it currently is. And that, more than anything else, can make Ukraine's F-16 capable of turning the tide of the Ukraine war. With Saab 340s at their sides, Ukraine's F-16s become cruise and ballistic missile destroying machines, creating enormous costs for the Russian military while making their future missile strikes less effective. Perhaps that's why the Russian company Forez, likely under advice from Putin, is offering a 15 million ruble reward to the first soldier who manages to shoot down an F-16. That bounty, which amounts to about $170,000, is a sure sign that Putin needs Ukraine's F-16s out of the sky so he can continue his special military operation in the way he envisions it. Of course, there are still challenges ahead for Ukraine. The 6 F-16s it's received so far, or rather 5 now that one crashed, are far from enough to allow Ukraine to establish air superiority. They also aren't enough for Ukraine to fully realize its defensive strategy, meaning Ukraine can't start sending its Soviet-era fighters to the front lines yet. There's also the training issue to confront. 6 months of training has made Ukraine's pilots capable, but they're not at the stage where they can get the most out of the F-16 systems yet. Flying defensive missions, which are relatively low risk compared to frontline sorties, can boost flight hours, but there's still a clear skill gap that needs to be filled. It's also worth pointing out that Ukraine doesn't have access to the most modern weapons the F-16 can use. The US and NATO may not want to risk the most advanced weapons providing an intelligence coup for potential adversaries, claims Task and Purpose, while pointing out that Russia may be able to reverse engineer anything that it captures from crashed F-16s. There's still plenty of good news for Ukraine to take away from its first use of the F-16. It knows the jets are capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky and that its pilots are well trained enough to make use of the planes. More flight hours will only build on this training, opening up further options in the future upon the arrival of the Saab 340s and the rest of the promised F-16 stock. And if Ukraine can maintain as many of its F-16s as possible, it's going to be able to use them to chip away at Russia's aerial and missile forces, as well as potentially offer support to its ground troops to drag Russia even deeper into a war of attrition that's already cost Putin and his military heavily. The F-16s aren't going to turn the tide of the war alone, but Ukraine's clever usage of them so far suggests that they'll become a vital piece of the Ukraine war puzzle, that when combined with Ukraine's other cost-creating strategies, will put and keep Putin on his back foot until he's forced to negotiate. What do you think about the arrival of the F-16s in Ukraine? Has Ukraine used them effectively so far, and do you think it will change up or build on its current strategies once more of these multi-role fighters arrive?